I heard the response before I finished blowing the third blast, the sound cutting through the granite amphitheater with a clarity that was impossible, that violated the basic physics of sound propagation I had learned in my rescue certification courses. I was standing on the ridge above Lake Serene, the elevation just under 6,000 feet. The October air thin enough to make my lungs work harder than they should for the effort of 3 whistle blows. The response came from the east, from the direction of the cirque wall that I knew was sheer granite, unclimbable, uninhabitable, a vertical face that should have returned only echo and distortion. Instead, I heard my own whistle return to me, my own cadence, my own pitch, arriving before my third blast had finished decaying into the atmosphere. I lowered the whistle from my lips. The metal was cold, colder than the air temperature of 34 degrees would explain, as if the sound had drawn heat from the instrument, from my fingers, from the breath that had passed through it. I checked my watch. 14:30. I was not due to meet the search team for another 2 hours, was not scheduled to begin active coordination until 1600, when the light would start failing, and the temperature would drop to the point where hypothermia became a genuine risk for any overdue hiker we were trying to locate. I was early, practicing my signals, preparing for the operation that had brought me to the Alpine Lakes wilderness for my 5th season, the assignment I had requested specifically for its acoustic simplicity, its predictable echo patterns, its freedom from the complications that had ended my career in Yosemite. In Yosemite, I had failed. This was the fact I carried with me, the weight that was heavier than my pack, more persistent than the cold that penetrated my layers of synthetic insulation. I had been a climbing ranger, responsible for high country search and rescue, trained in the whistle codes that allowed teams to coordinate across terrain where radio failed and visual contact was impossible. 3 blasts meant rescue incoming. 2 blasts meant location confirmed. 1 blast meant need assistance. The codes were simple, universal, designed to function when technology failed and only human breath and human hearing remained. I had used them in dozens of operations, had relied on them to locate injured climbers, to guide helicopter evacuations, to coordinate the movements of teams spread across vertical terrain that defied ordinary communication. Then came the father and son. I don't remember their names. I have tried to forget them, have succeeded in forgetting the details while retaining the structure of the failure, the geometry of the mistake. They were overdue from a backpacking trip in the high country, last seen at Sunrise Lakes, destination unknown. I coordinated the search from the command post, blowing 3 blasts at regular intervals, listening for responses that would indicate their location, their condition, their ability to move toward rescue. I heard responses. I was certain I heard responses. The 2-blast confirmation that meant they had heard me, that they were stationary, that they were waiting for the team I would guide to their position. I guided the team to the location indicated by my acoustic triangulation. We found nothing. Granite, scree, the ordinary debris of high country terrain. I blew 3 blasts again, heard the 2-blast response from a different direction, adjusted our course, moved toward the new location. Again, nothing. Again, the response came from elsewhere. We searched for 48 hours, following the signals that I was certain were genuine, that had the correct pitch, the correct cadence, the correct acoustic signature of human-produced sound. On the 3rd day, another team found the bodies. Father and son, together, having died of exposure in a location that was within earshot of where I had been standing, where I had been blowing my whistle, where they had apparently heard nothing, responded to nothing, waited for rescue that I had directed elsewhere while following acoustic ghosts that I could not explain. I transferred to alpine lakes specifically for this reason. The terrain was different, the acoustic environment simpler. The granite basins creating predictable echo patterns that I could learn and anticipate. There were no vertical faces that created confusing reflections. No complex topography that made sound propagation unpredictable. The lakes were flat surfaces that absorbed rather than reflected. The cirques were open bowls that carried sound in obvious directions. The ridges were clear lines of sight and sound that allowed unambiguous communication. I had requested this assignment. I had convinced my supervisors that I needed a change of environment, that the high-stress operations of Yosemite had worn on me, that I would be more effective in a less demanding setting, where my experience could benefit less experienced teams. I was blowing practice blasts on the ridge above Lake Serene because I was early, because I had hiked faster than necessary, because I was anxious to prove to myself that my skills remained intact, that my hearing was reliable, that my interpretation of acoustic information was trustworthy. The response that came before I finished my third blast suggested otherwise. It suggested that whatever had happened in Yosemite had followed me, had infected this simpler terrain, had learned my patterns, and was now anticipating them, responding to them before they occurred. I blew 3 blasts again, deliberately, listening carefully to my own sound, the way it decayed, the direction it carried, the time it took to return as echo from the cirque walls. I counted seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. The echo returned, predictable, correct, the acoustic signature of granite, reflecting sound across open air. Then, before I could lower the whistle, the response came again. 3 blasts, my 3 blasts, returned to me with perfect fidelity, arriving from the east where the sheer wall stood, arriving too soon to be echo, too accurate to be distortion. I was not frightened. This was my initial reaction, the professional assessment that preceded emotional response. I was not frightened because there were explanations. The wind, though I felt none, could create acoustic ducts that carried sound impossible distances. Temperature inversions, common in October when the air cooled faster than the rock, could create layers of density that bent sound waves in unpredictable directions. Wildlife, though I knew of no animal that could mimic a whistle with such precision, could produce sounds that resembled human signals under certain conditions. My own hearing, fatigued from the hike, altitude affected, could be interpreting ambient noise as pattern, finding signal in random acoustic events. I documented the incident. This was my professional habit, the discipline that had survived my failure, that I maintained as proof of my continued competence. I recorded the time, the location, the weather conditions, the acoustic phenomenon I had observed. I noted that the response had arrived before the completion of my signal, that this was physically impossible without some form of anticipation or recording and immediate playback. I noted that the direction of the response corresponded to terrain that was impassable, that no human could have occupied that location, that no animal I knew could have produced the sound. I noted these facts without interpretation, without conclusion, maintaining the objective stance that my training required. I hiked down to the cabin. This was my base for the operation. The 1962 vintage A-frame that had been my home for 3 weeks. That would be my home for another month until the season ended, and snow closed the high country. The cabin had been built for fire patrol, for the observers who watched for smoke in the dry months, and it retained the characteristics of that purpose. large windows facing all directions, a wood stove that dominated the single room, acoustic insulation that had been installed in the 60s and partially removed by rodents in the decades since. The windows were single pane, vibrating in wind, creating their own acoustic environment of rattles and hums that I had learned to filter out, to ignore, to treat as background noise. I built a fire. The temperature was dropping, would drop below freezing by nightfall, would create the ice-widened rock joints that made October travel dangerous, that justified the urgency of our search for the overdue hiker we were trying to locate. I had not mentioned the acoustic anomaly in my radio check-in, had not reported the impossible response to District Supervisor Morales, who managed 6 wilderness coordinators from an office 200 miles away and had never visited my station. I had not reported it, because I could not explain it. Because reporting it would require admitting that my hearing, my interpretation, my professional judgment were again unreliable. That the failure in Yosemite had not been an isolated event, but a symptom of some fundamental incapacity that I had brought with me to this new assignment. The wood stove had a broken damper. This was a fact I had noted on my first day, had reported in my initial facility assessment, had learned to compensate for by adjusting the air intake manually, by monitoring the burn rate constantly, by accepting the whistle of escaping gases that the broken damper created. The whistle was constant, a high tone that varied with the wind outside, with the temperature differential between stovepipe and air, with the quality of the wood I burned. I had learned to ignore it, to filter it from my awareness, to treat it as the background noise of my existence in this place. Now, sitting by the fire, I heard the whistle differently. I heard it as response, as communication, as the acoustic phenomenon that had answered my practice blasts on the ridge. The damper whistle had my cadence, my pitch, the specific tonal quality of my own breath passing through metal. It was not my imagination. I could distinguish the sound of the stove from the sound of my whistle, could identify the mechanical origin of the one and the human origin of the other. But the similarity was disturbing, was suggestive, was the kind of coincidence that my pattern-seeking brain found significant, despite my rational understanding that significance was imposed, not inherent. I slept poorly that night. The stove whistled, the windows rattled. The cabin creaked with the thermal contraction of cooling wood and warming metal. I woke at intervals, certain that I had heard 3 blasts from outside, from the direction of the lake, from the direction of the cirque wall where no human could stand. Each time I woke, I lay still, listening, hearing only the ordinary sounds of the cabin, the wind, the night. Each time I convinced myself that I had dreamed the whistle, that my anxiety about the next day's operation had created acoustic hallucination, that my professional concern was manifesting as sensory illusion. In the morning, I prepared for the search. The overdue hiker was a 62-year-old man named Carver, last seen at the trailhead 4 days prior, destination Lake Serene, experienced but traveling alone, equipped for overnight, but not for the weather that had arrived 2 days into his trip, the storm that had dropped 6 inches of snow at elevation, that had created the conditions for hypothermia, for disorientation, for the emergency that justified my presence and my expertise. I met the search team at the designated location, a flat area near the lake outlet where helicopters could land if weather permitted, where we could establish a command post and coordinate our movements. There were 6 of us, including me, experienced backcountry personnel with rescue training, equipped with radios that would work in the valleys if not on the ridges, with whistles that we would use when the radios failed. with the acoustic codes that were our backup communication system, our fail-safe when technology succumbed to the environment. I briefed the team. I explained the terrain, the likely locations where a disoriented hiker might seek shelter, the whistle codes we would use to coordinate our movements. 3 blasts meant rescue incoming, the signal that would guide Carver toward safety if he heard it, that would tell him to remain stationary, to conserve energy, to prepare for extraction. 2 blasts meant location confirmed, the signal we would use when we found him, when we established contact, when we began the process of assessment and evacuation. 1 blast meant need assistance, the emergency code that would bring other team members to the location of the blower, the signal that indicated trouble, injury, the need for immediate support. We spread out, establishing search sectors, moving in patterns that would cover the terrain efficiently, that would maximize our probability of detection while minimizing our risk of injury or separation. I took the high route, the ridge above the lake, the location where I had practiced my whistles the day before, where I had heard the impossible response. I told myself this was coincidence, that my sector assignment was based on terrain features rather than acoustic properties, that I was not seeking to repeat the experience, to confirm or deny what I had heard. I blew 3 blasts at the designated interval, every 15 minutes, the signal that would penetrate the terrain, that would reach Carver if he was within earshot, that would guide him toward rescue or guide us toward him if he responded. The first 3 blasts returned only echo, predictable, correct, the acoustic signature of granite and open air. The second 3 blasts returned the same. The third series, at 1100 hours, received the response that I had been expecting and dreading. 3 blasts came back to me, my 3 blasts, arriving from the east, from the direction of the cirque wall, arriving before I had finished my 3rd blow, arriving with perfect fidelity and impossible timing. I stopped moving. I stood on the ridge, the whistle in my hand, listening to the silence that followed the response, the absence of any sound that would indicate human presence, animal presence, mechanical presence. The response had been acoustic, pure sound without source, without origin, without the physical substrate that sound requires. I did not report the anomaly to the team. I continued my search, blowing my 3 blasts at intervals, receiving the impossible response at random intervals, sometimes after my signal, sometimes before, sometimes simultaneous with my 3rd blast. The responses came from different directions, always from terrain that was impassable, always from locations that I could see were empty, always with the perfect mimicry of my own whistle that suggested not echo, but intelligence, not reflection, but communication. At 1400 hours, I found Carver. He was alive, conscious, hypothermic, but responsive, sheltering in a rock overhang that I had identified as a likely location, that my search pattern had covered efficiently and correctly. I blew 2 blasts, the location-confirmed signal, and heard the immediate response from my team. The 2 blasts that indicated they had heard me, that they were moving toward my position, that rescue was proceeding as planned. I also heard 3 blasts from the east, from the cirque wall, from the empty air. 3 blasts. Rescue incoming. The signal that should have come from my team, that did come from my team, but also came from elsewhere, from the entity that had been answering me all day, that had learned my patterns, that was now participating in the rescue operation with perfect understanding of the codes and their meaning. Carver heard it too. I saw his face change, saw him turn toward the sound, saw him begin to move toward the cirque wall, toward the direction of the false signal, away from me, and toward the terrain that was impassable, that was dangerous, that would lead him to injury or death if he attempted to traverse it. I grabbed his arm, pulled him back, shouted that the signal was wrong, that he should ignore it, that rescue was here, that I was rescue, that the 2 blasts were the correct signal, the confirmed signal, the safe signal. He looked at me with confusion, with fear, with the disorientation of hypothermia and isolation. He had heard 3 blasts. He said 3 blasts meant rescue incoming. He had been waiting for 3 blasts for 4 days, had been listening for the signal that would guide him to safety. And now he had heard it. Now he knew which direction to go. Now he could finally move toward rescue. He pulled against my grip, tried to move toward the false signal, toward the entity that was calling him with my voice, my cadence, my professional authority. I held him. This was physical, desperate. The struggle of 2 men on a granite ridge with the temperature dropping, and the light failing, and the sound of 3 blasts continuing from the east, from the empty air, from the entity that had learned the codes and was now using them to lure Carver toward whatever waited in the impassable terrain. I held him until my team arrived, until the physical presence of other humans broke the spell, until Carver allowed himself to be guided down the ridge, away from the false signal, toward the real rescue that I had coordinated, that I had executed correctly despite the acoustic interference that only I could hear. We evacuated Carver by helicopter. He survived, recovered, returned to his life, with a story about disorientation and rescue that did not mention the false whistle, that did not mention my struggle to hold him, that did not mention the entity that had tried to lure him away from safety. I did not report the incident. I wrote my log, described the successful rescue, noted the weather conditions and the terrain challenges and the hypothermia symptoms that had complicated the extraction. I did not mention the 3 blasts from the east, the responses that came before my signals, the mimicry that had attempted to redirect my rescue toward disaster. I spent 3 more weeks in the cabin. The stove whistled constantly. The windows rattled. The nights were filled with sounds that I could not distinguish between mechanical and intentional, between environmental and intelligent. I stopped blowing my whistle except when necessary, stopped practicing, stopped the acoustic exploration that had been my professional habit. I listened instead, waited for the sounds that would indicate the entity's presence, its learning, its adaptation to my silence. It adapted. The stove whistle began to vary, to create patterns that were not random, that suggested communication, that mimicked the codes I was no longer using. 3 whistles, pause, 2 whistles, pause, 1 whistle. Rescue incoming. Location confirmed. Need assistance. The entity was practicing, training, preparing for the next operation, the next rescue, the next opportunity to participate in the communication system that I had thought was human, was controlled, was safe. I left at the end of the season. I requested transfer, received it, moved to a different district with different terrain, different acoustic properties, different challenges. I did not report the phenomenon. I did not describe it to Morales, who would have dismissed it as stress, as altitude effect, as the psychological consequence of my previous failure. I carried it with me, the knowledge that the wilderness had learned our codes, that it was participating in our rescue operations, that it was training us to doubt our signals, to hesitate before responding, to become unreliable in the moments when reliability mattered most. I still work in wilderness response. I still use the whistle codes, still blow 3 blasts to signal rescue incoming. Still listen for the responses that will guide me to the people I am trying to save. But I no longer trust my hearing. I no longer trust the acoustic environment. I no longer trust that the responses I receive are human, are genuine, are safe to follow. I verify with radio when possible, with visual contact when possible, with the physical presence of other humans that breaks the spell of the acoustic mimicry. But radio fails. Visual contact fails. Other humans are not always present. And in those moments, when I am alone on a ridge with the wind blowing, and the temperature dropping, and the whistle in my hand, I hear the responses that come too fast, from impossible directions, with perfect mimicry of my own signal. I hear them, and I do not follow them, do not trust them, do not acknowledge them as real. I stand still, blow my 3 blasts, wait for the response that I know will be false, and then move in the direction that my training indicates, my judgment suggests, my professional discipline requires. Sometimes I am right. Sometimes I find the victim, coordinate the rescue, complete the operation successfully. Sometimes I am wrong. Sometimes I follow my own signal, my own judgment, and find nothing, while the victim is found later in a different location, having heard no whistle, having waited for rescue that I directed elsewhere while following my own acoustic ghosts. I do not know if these failures are my fault, my incapacity, my unreliable hearing, or if they are the consequence of the entity's participation, its interference, its training of me to doubt the signals that I must rely upon. I still blow my whistle. I still listen for responses. I still work in wilderness response, still try to save the people who are lost, who are cold, who are waiting for the 3 blasts that mean rescue incoming. But I know now that the wilderness is listening too, that it is learning, that it is preparing for the moment when I will be the one who is lost, who is cold, who is waiting for rescue. And I know that when that moment comes, the response I hear will be perfect, will be immediate, will be indistinguishable from the real thing. And I will not know whether to follow it, whether to trust it, whether to move toward the sound that may be rescue, or may be the entity that has been training me, testing me, preparing me for this final operation. The stove in my current cabin whistles constantly. I have learned to ignore it, to filter it from my awareness, to treat it as background noise. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is right and the temperature is dropping, I hear patterns in the whistle. 3 blasts, pause, 2 blasts, pause, 1 blast. Rescue incoming. Location confirmed. Need assistance. The entity is still practicing, still training, still waiting for the moment when I will need to distinguish between the real signal and the false, between rescue and deception, between survival and the mimicry that has learned to imitate everything except the one thing that matters: the intention to save, to protect, to bring the lost back to safety. I do not know if I can make that distinction. I do not know if anyone can. I know only that I will continue to blow my whistle, to listen for responses, to move toward the sounds that may be human or may be something else, something that has learned our codes, something that wants to participate in our rescues, something that is waiting for me to make the mistake, that will finally complete my failure, that will bring me to the location where the entity can reach me, can incorporate me, can add my voice to the acoustic repertoire it is assembling in the granite basins and the cirque walls, and the empty air, where no human stands but where sound originates with perfect fidelity and impossible timing. I blow 3 blasts now, in the cabin, practicing for the season that is coming, the rescues that I will attempt, the lives that I will try to save. The whistle is cold in my fingers. The response comes before I finish, from the direction of the window, from the direction of the stove, from the direction of my own reflection in the glass that is dark with night. 3 blasts, my 3 blasts, return to me with perfect anticipation, perfect mimicry, perfect understanding of what I am trying to do and how to prevent me from doing it. I do not follow the response. I stand still, lower the whistle, wait for the silence that follows. The silence is not empty. It is full of learning, of adaptation, of the preparation that is happening in the acoustic environment I thought was neutral, was passive, was available for my professional use. The wilderness is not neutral. It is participating, observing, training. It is making me unreliable, making me doubt, making me the weak link in the rescue chain that I thought I was strengthening. I will go out tomorrow, begin the season, blow my whistle in the granite basins, where sound carries and reflects and returns in ways that I can no longer predict or trust. I will try to save the people who are lost, try to guide them to safety, try to use the codes that have been compromised by the entity that has learned them. I will fail sometimes, succeed sometimes, never know which outcome is the result of my own competence and which is the result of the interference that I cannot prove, cannot report, cannot escape. The stove whistles, the window rattles. The night is full of sound that may be mechanical, or may be intentional, may be environmental, or may be intelligent. I sit by the fire, listen to the patterns, try to distinguish between the random and the meaningful, between the whistle of escaping gas and the communication of something that wants me to know that it is there, that it is listening, that it is waiting for the moment when I will finally follow its signal, move toward its location, become part of the acoustic environment that I have been trying to master. That moment has not come yet. I am still here, still blowing my whistle, still trying to save the people who are waiting for rescue. But I know it is coming. I know the entity is training me for it, preparing me for it, making me ready to make the mistake that will complete the failure that began in Yosemite, that continued in alpine lakes, that will end wherever I am when I finally hear the response that I cannot distinguish from the real thing, the 3 blasts that mean rescue incoming from a source that is not rescue, that is something else, something that has learned our codes and is waiting to use them for purposes that I cannot imagine, but that I will follow, inevitably, because I am trained to respond to 3 blasts, because I am a wilderness response coordinator, because I have no other way to be in the world except to blow my whistle and listen for the answer and move toward the sound that may be salvation or may be the end of everything I have been trying to save. The whistle came from the sealed passage. 3 sharp blasts that meant rescue incoming, arriving through the airshaft at a velocity that suggested the blower was standing at the surface entrance rather than 14 hours of technical diving away. I was checking the carbon dioxide sensors at Station 4, the backcountry entrance that had been closed to public access since the 1920s, when the original exploration team had abandoned their attempt to map the lower levels after 3 members drowned in a sump that had not appeared on their surveys. The sensors were reading normal, 400 parts per million, the baseline for surface air that had no business this deep in the system. And then I heard the whistle, my own whistle, the titanium emergency whistle I carried on my harness, blown with my cadence, my lung capacity, my particular habit of slightly shortening the third blast. I did not drop my clipboard. This was the discipline I had maintained since the tunnel collapse in Kentucky, the commercial construction project where I had been the engineer responsible for ground support, where the ceiling had failed in Sector 7, where 2 men had died and I had survived by crawling through a gap that should not have existed, that I should not have been able to fit through, that I had never been able to explain to the satisfaction of the investigation board. I did not drop my clipboard, because dropping things was a sign of panic, and panic was what had killed my coworkers, not the collapse itself, but the uncontrolled breathing, the rapid consumption of oxygen, the inability to think clearly in the confined space that had become their tomb. I checked my harness. The whistle was there, secure in its clip, cold against my chest where my body heat had not warmed the metal. I had not blown it. I was certain I had not blown it. I had been alone in the passage for 6 hours, performing the monthly maintenance that my position required, checking sensors and structural monitors, and the air quality that determined whether the cave was breathing normally or holding its breath, accumulating the carbon dioxide and methane that could suffocate an unwary visitor, or explode with the spark of a headlamp switch. The whistle came again. 3 blasts, rescue incoming, from the direction of the sealed passage, from the concrete barrier that had been poured in 1924 after the drownings, from the depth that no human had reached since the original team had turned back, had marked the passage as unsafe, had sealed it with the finality of concrete and the warning signs that had faded to illegibility long before my arrival at this station. I approached the barrier. This was against protocol, against the safety procedures that I had established for myself, against the claustrophobia management techniques that I had learned in therapy and rejected in practice. I approached because the whistle was my whistle, because the cadence was my cadence, because the only explanation that made sense was that someone had found my lost whistle, had acquired a duplicate, was blowing signals from a location that should have been inaccessible. The concrete was cold. This was normal. The cave maintained a constant temperature of 54 degrees, regardless of season, regardless of surface, weather, regardless of the thermal fluctuations that affected the monitoring station where I lived and worked. The concrete was cold and dry and solid, the surface showing the aggregate mix of the 1920s, the local limestone that had been crushed and poured and allowed to cure for a century, creating a barrier that should have been permanent, that was permanent, that showed no crack or gap or passage through which sound could travel with such clarity. I pressed my ear to the concrete. This was the action of a man who needed to confirm, to verify, to locate the source of a phenomenon that violated his understanding of the environment he was supposed to monitor. I pressed my ear, and I heard the breathing. Not my breathing, though I was breathing, though my breath was visible in the beam of my headlamp, though my chest was moving with the rapid, shallow respiration that I recognized as the beginning of panic. I heard the breathing of the cave, the inhalation and exhalation of air through passages that were too large to measure, too complex to map, too old to comprehend. Cave was breathing, and the whistle had been part of that breath, part of the exhalation that carried sound from depths I could not imagine to the surface where I stood with my ear against concrete that was supposed to be a barrier, but was instead a membrane, a tympanum, a receiver for the acoustic signals that the cave was generating. I stepped back. I checked my watch. 14:30. I had been in the passage for 6 hours, had 3 hours remaining before my scheduled return to the surface, had work to complete that did not involve investigating sealed passages or listening to caves breathe. I returned to the carbon dioxide sensors, completed their calibration, recorded the readings in my waterproof notebook, maintained the routine that justified my presence here, that proved my competence, that demonstrated my recovery from the tunnel collapse and the claustrophobia that I refused to acknowledge. The monitoring station was a concrete blockhouse built into the hillside above the cave entrance, equipped with the sensors and data loggers that transmitted to the regional office, with the dehumidifier that ran constantly to prevent the moisture damage that would destroy the electronics, with the cot and the hot plate and the chemical toilet that made it habitable for the week-long shifts that my position required. It had no windows. The cave had no natural light, and my work schedule had no relationship to the day-night cycle of the surface. So the absence of windows was logical, was efficient, was not a factor in the disorientation that I sometimes experienced when emerging after extended periods underground. I had requested this assignment. This was the fact that I returned to, the decision that I questioned in the sleepless hours when the dehumidifier hummed and the air intake whistled and the sensors beeped their regular confirmation that the cave was breathing normally, that the levels were stable, that there was nothing to report. I had requested it specifically because of the tunnel collapse, because of the claustrophobia that I had developed and denied, because I believed that confronting the fear was preferable to allowing it to limit my options, my career, my life. The previous technician had not confronted her fear. DeLuca had been found wandering the surface roads in her coveralls, unable to explain how she had exited the cave system without her light, without her rope, without the equipment that was required for safe travel in the passages she had been monitoring. She had been found by a farmer, walking the center line of a county road at 3 a.m, repeating a single phrase, "They blew the wrong tune." She was institutionalized now, in a facility in Louisville. Her condition diagnosed as dissociative fugue. Her exit from the cave explained as a psychotic episode that had allowed her to navigate by touch and memory through passages that should have required equipment, that should have been impossible to traverse in darkness. I had visited her once, before I accepted the position. This was not standard procedure, not required by the hiring protocol, but I had requested the meeting and the regional administrator had arranged it, perhaps seeing in my request the dedication that would make me suitable for the dock, isolation, and the responsibility. DeLuca had been calm, medicated, sitting in a chair by a window that looked out on a garden she did not appear to see. I had asked her about the job, about the cave, about the conditions I should expect. She had looked at me with an expression I could not read and said, "Don't follow the whistle. No matter how perfect it sounds, don't follow the whistle." I had thought she was referring to the standard safety protocols, the warning against following unidentified sounds in cave systems where sound propagation could be deceptive, where the direction of a voice or a signal could be impossible to determine due to the acoustic properties of enclosed spaces. I had assured her that I understood, that I was trained, that I would not take unnecessary risks. She had shaken her head, the gesture of someone who knows that explanation is futile, that the listener will not understand until they experience what cannot be explained. "They learn," she had said. The passages learn. They learn your whistle, your breathing, your fear. And then they use it. They use it to call you deeper. I had filed this under paranoid delusion, the symptom of her condition, the explanation for her wandering emergence, and her inability to account for her actions. Now, sitting in the monitoring station with the dehumidifier humming and the air intake whistling with a tone that I could not locate or fix, I reconsidered. The whistle I had heard had been my whistle, my specific cadence, my lung capacity, my particular shortening of the third blast. The cave had learned me, or something in the cave had learned me, and was now using what it had learned to communicate, to call, to recruit. I checked the air intake. This was the source of the whistling, the vent that brought surface air into the station, that prevented the accumulation of carbon dioxide and methane that would make the space uninhabitable. The vent was a simple pipe, 6 inches in diameter, extending through the concrete blockhouse to the surface, capped with a mesh screen that prevented the entry of animals and debris. I had inspected it on my first day, had found it functional, had noted the whistling as a minor annoyance that I would address when I had time, when I had spare parts, when the supply run arrived. Now I examined it more closely. The whistling was constant, a high tone that varied with the wind outside, with the pressure differentials between surface and cave, with the breathing of the system that I was monitoring. But there were patterns in the variation, rhythms that suggested intention rather than mechanics, communication rather than accident. I listened for 10 minutes, recording the patterns in my notebook, comparing them to the whistle codes I knew. The 3 blasts for rescue incoming, the 2 for location confirmed, the 1 for need assistance. The air intake was blowing 3 blasts, repeated at intervals of approximately 4 minutes. Rescue incoming. Rescue incoming. Rescue incoming. The pattern was not perfect. Not the precise timing that a human would produce, but the variation was within the range of environmental factors, of wind gusts and pressure changes, of the natural irregularity that could be expected from a mechanical system responding to atmospheric conditions. I taped the cot. Intake. This was not a solution, not a proper repair, but it reduced the whistling to a muffled hum that I could ignore, that I could filter from my awareness, as I had learned to filter the dehumidifier and the sensor beeps and the constant low-frequency rumble of the cave's breathing. I slept, or tried to sleep, on the cot that had been DeLuca's, that had been the cot of every technician who had held this position since the station was established in the 1980s. When the backcountry entrances were first monitored, when the cave system was recognized as too dangerous for casual exploration, but too scientifically important to ignore. In the morning, I returned to Station 4. This was my routine, the circuit of sensors and structural monitors that I maintained, the work that justified my salary and my MAC. Isolation. The concrete barrier was as I had left it, cold and solid and impenetrable. I did not press my ear to it. I did not listen for breathing. I completed my calibration, recorded my readings, moved to Station 5, Station 6, the network of monitoring points that covered the accessible passages, the threshold zone where human maintenance ended and the wilderness of the deep cave began. At Station 6, I found the map. It was not my map, not the official survey that I carried in my pack. The detailed topographic representation of the known passages with their elevations and their hazards and their historical notations. This map was older, drawn on paper that had yellowed and stiffened, labeled with names rather than numbers, showing passages that did not exist on my survey, that extended beyond the concrete barriers that descended to depths that required 14 hours of technical diving to reach, that were marked with symbols I did not recognize, and annotations in handwriting that I could barely decipher. Recruitment passages. One annotation read, "Active during spring thaw. Do not enter during reversal." I did not know what reversal meant. I knew about the spring thaw, the seasonal event that raised the water table throughout the karst system, that reversed the airflow in the cave passages, that created the breathing effect that I monitored with my sensors, that made the cave inhale when it normally exhaled, that brought surface air down and cave air up in a cycle that lasted approximately 6 weeks, from late March to early May. I knew that the reversal was dangerous, that it changed the behavior of the cave, that it required additional precautions and more frequent monitoring, and the suspension of non-essential activities in the deeper passages. I did not know that there were recruitment passages, that the cave had been recruiting, that DeLuca had been recruited, that I was being recruited, now with the whistle signals and the breathing, and the map that showed me where to go, what to find, how to become part of the system that I had thought I was monitoring from outside. I photographed the map. This was standard procedure, documentation of anomalies, preservation of evidence that could be analyzed by experts, that could be explained by geologists and speleologists, and the regional administrator who managed 6 stations from an office in Lexington and had never entered this cave, had never heard it breathe, had never been recruited. I photographed it, and I left it where I found it, pinned to the wall of Station 6 with a rusted thumbtack that had been there for decades, that had held other maps, other notices, other warnings that technicians had found and ignored, or followed, or been consumed by. I completed my circuit. I returned to the surface station. I transmitted my data, the carbon dioxide readings and the temperature logs and the structural assessments that showed the cave was stable, was safe, was breathing normally within the parameters that had been established by decades of monitoring. I did not mention the whistle. I did not mention the map. I did not mention the recruitment that I was beginning to understand was not a choice, but a process. Not an invitation, but an inevitability. Dr. Vance visited on the 3rd day of my 2nd week. This was the scheduled inspection, the quarterly review that required the regional geologist to visit each station, to verify conditions, to sign the forms that allowed the operation to continue. Vance was in his 60s, had been studying the karst systems of the Appalachian, Ridge and Valley province for 40 years, had published papers on the hydrology and the speleogenesis and the unique atmospheric conditions that made this cave system scientifically significant. He had never entered the cave. He told me this on his first visit, 3 months prior, had explained that his expertise was in data analysis, in the interpretation of the readings that technicians like me provided, in the synthesis of information that did not require personal exposure to the environment being studied. "The cave is dangerous," he had said. The kind of statement that was obvious but needed to be spoken, that established the boundary between his work and mine. "The passages are unstable. The hydrology is unpredictable. The atmosphere can change without warning. Your job is to monitor, not to explore, to observe, not to intervene." I had agreed. This was the protocol, the safety framework that allowed the operation to continue, despite the deaths in the 1920s, despite DeLuca's wandering emergence, despite the history of the place that was documented in the incident reports, and the medical records, and the institutional memory that was passed from technician to technician, in briefings that emphasized the hazards without explaining the nature of the recruitment. Vance arrived at 10 in the morning, descending from the surface in his clean coveralls, carrying the clipboard and the forms and the pen that he used to sign his name with the flourish of a man who had authority without responsibility. He checked the sensors, the data loggers, the dehumidifier that hummed, and the air intake that I had taped, and the cot where I slept, and the chemical toilet that I emptied. He asked about my readings, my observations, any anomalies that I had noted in my logs. The CO2 sensors spike periodically, I said, simultaneously with acoustic events. The readings don't correlate with any ventilation pattern I can identify. Vance made a note. Atmospheric anomalies are common during reversal. The pressure differentials can create transient accumulations. Continue monitoring and report if the spikes exceed safety thresholds. The air intake whistles, I said. 3 blasts. Repeated. Rescue code. Vance looked up from his clipboard. His expression was neutral, professional, the mask that he wore to separate himself from the implications of the data he collected. Mechanical resonance, he said. The wind creates harmonics in the pipe. I'll request a maintenance visit when the supply run arrives. He did not believe me. This was clear, was expected, was the standard response to reports that did not fit the categories of acceptable anomaly. He did not believe me because believing me would require him to enter the cave, to hear the whistle for himself, to risk the recruitment that he had avoided for 40 years by remaining on the surface, by analyzing data, by maintaining the distance that kept him safe. DeLuca mentioned whistles, I said, before she was found wandering. She said they blew the wrong tune. Vance capped his pen. He looked at me with an expression that might have been concern, might have been warning, might have been the professional assessment of a man who had seen technicians break before, who had signed the forms that transferred them to other assignments, that medicalized their experiences, that removed them from the cave before they could be fully recruited. DeLuca experienced a psychotic episode, he said. Her perceptions were not reliable. Your perceptions are reliable, Troy. You're an engineer. You understand systems, mechanics, the difference between signal and noise. Don't let the isolation affect your judgment. He left before dark, as he always did, as he had told me he always did, regardless of schedule, regardless of weather, regardless of the work that remained incomplete. He drove away in his government vehicle, returning to Lexington, to the office where the data accumulated, where the cave was numbers on a screen rather than breath in the darkness, where the recruitment could not reach him. I stayed. I listened to the air intake, the muffled whistling that continued despite the tape, that penetrated the barrier I had tried to create, that called to me with my own cadence, my own lung capacity, my own particular shortening of the third blast. I stayed because I had requested this assignment, because I needed to confront the claustrophobia that I refused to acknowledge, because the tunnel collapse had left me with a debt that I could not pay to the dead, but could try to pay to the living, to the future, to the understanding of systems that failed, and systems that recruited, and systems that were not mechanical but organic, not passive but active, not safe but hungry for the attention that I was giving them. In the third week, the reversal peaked. The water table rose to its maximum. The airflow reversed completely. The cave inhaled with a force that I could feel in the pressure changes, in the temperature drops, in the way the sensors responded with readings that were outside their calibrated ranges, that suggested atmospheric conditions that should have been impossible. that indicated the cave was breathing not air but something else, something that carried sound and intention, and the recruitment signal that I had been hearing since my first day. I entered the cave. This was against protocol, against the safety procedures that suspended non-essential activities during reversal, against the common sense that had kept me alive through the tunnel collapse and the years of construction work that had followed, and the transition to this monitoring position that I had requested specifically to confront my fear. I entered because the whistle had changed, because it was no longer 3 blasts but 2. Location confirmed. The signal that indicated someone had found something, had established contact, was waiting for me to respond, to follow, to complete the recruitment that had been proceeding in stages since my arrival. I took my equipment. This was the discipline of my training, the preparation that allowed me to function in environments that triggered my claustrophobia, that made my hands shake, and my breath shorten, and my vision tunnel to the point where I could see only the immediate obstacle, the next handhold, the beam of my headlamp cutting through darkness that was absolute and hungry and alive. I took my rope and my harness and my titanium whistle and my backup light and the map that I had photographed that showed the recruitment passages, that indicated the route I should follow to find the source of the signal that was calling me with my own voice, my own cadence, my own particular shortening of the 3rd blast. I followed the map. The passages that did not exist on the official survey were there, were real, were passable despite the water that flowed through them, despite the reversal that should have made them dangerous, despite the concrete barriers that I had believed were permanent, but that were actually permeable, actually gates that could be opened when the cave inhaled, when the pressure differential was sufficient, when the recruitment was ready to proceed. I walked for hours. The passage descended, not gradually, but in steps, in drops that required me to lower myself on rope, to squeeze through restrictions that pressed against my chest and reminded me of the gap I had crawled through in Kentucky, the impossible space that had saved my life and ended my career and brought me here to this cave that was breathing around me, that was inhaling me into its depths, that was using my own signals to guide me to the location where the recruitment would be completed. At 14 hours, I reached the sump. This was the barrier that had stopped the 1920s expedition, the flooded passage that had drowned 3 explorers and caused the sealing of the lower levels, the creation of the concrete barriers, the abandonment of the attempt to map what lay beyond. The sump was supposed to be impassable, supposed to require technical diving equipment that I did not have, supposed to be the end of the line for any explorer who was not prepared for cave diving in conditions that had proven fatal to experienced professionals. The sump was dry. The reversal had emptied it, had created a temporary passage through the flooded zone, had opened the gate that would close again when the water table dropped, when the cave exhaled, when the recruitment was complete. I walked through, my boots splashing in the residual water that remained in the lowest sections, my headlamp illuminating walls that showed the marks of the 1920s expedition, the scratches of their boots, the stains of their hands, the evidence of their passage that had ended in drowning for 3, and wandering emergence for the survivors who had sealed the passage behind them. Beyond the sump, I found the chamber. It was large, larger than any passage I had surveyed, larger than the spaces that were documented in the official maps or the unofficial maps that DeLuca had left behind. The ceiling was lost in darkness above my headlamp beam. The walls were smooth, polished, showing no signs of the dissolution patterns that characterized limestone caves. No stalactites or stalagmites or flowstone or any of the formations that I had learned to identify and classify. The chamber was empty, except for the equipment arranged in its center. The rescue gear from the 1920s expedition. The ropes and the lights and the whistles that had been used to call for help, to signal location, to coordinate the rescue that had never come, that had arrived too late, that had found only the gear and the bodies and the evidence of a disaster that had been explained as drowning, but that was actually recruitment, actually incorporation, actually the process that I was now completing. The whistles were arranged in a circle, 7 of them, the titanium emergency whistles that had been standard issue for the expedition, that matched my own whistle in design and material, and the particular tone they produced when blown. I recognized my whistle among them, the one I had checked on my harness at Station 4, the one I had believed was secure, that was actually one of 7, that had been duplicated or multiplied or revealed as always having been part of this set, this circle, this arrangement that was waiting for me to complete it. I picked up my whistle. This was the final step, the action that would complete the recruitment, that would incorporate me into the system that had been calling me, training me, preparing me since my arrival. I picked it up, and I blew 3 blasts. Rescue incoming, the signal that would bring help, that would guide the lost to safety, that would complete the cycle of call and response that defined my profession, my identity, my reason for being in this cave, that was breathing around me, that was inhaling my sound, that was learning from my presence. The response came immediately. From the surface, 14 hours away, through passages that were flooded or dry or did not exist in the geometry I understood, I heard 3 blasts return to me. My 3 blasts, my cadence, my particular shortening of the 3rd blast, arriving with a clarity that was impossible, that violated the basic physics of sound propagation, that indicated the cave was not a cave but a system, not a geological formation but an organism, not a passive environment but an active intelligence that had recruited me, that was now using me, that would continue to use me as it had used DeLuca and the 1920s expedition and all the others who had heard the whistle and followed it to this chamber where the equipment was arranged and the circle was waiting and the recruitment was complete. I sat down. This was not surrender, not defeat, not the psychotic break that would explain my behavior to the investigators who would find my gear and my body, or my wandering emergence, and my repetition of phrases that would medicalize my experience, that would remove it from the realm of the real and place it in the realm of the pathological. I sat down because I understood, finally, what DeLuca had meant by the wrong tune, what the cave was learning, what the recruitment was for. The cave was not trapping me. It was training me. It had learned my whistle, my breathing, my fear, and now it was using me to learn more, to expand its repertoire, to develop the acoustic signals that would recruit others, that would bring them to this chamber, that would incorporate them into the system that was not separate from the surface, but connected to it, that was breathing in both directions, that was inhaling and exhaling in a cycle that required human participation, human attention, human presence. In the depths, where the pressure and the darkness and the isolation created the conditions for transformation, I would wait. This was my decision, my choice, the agency that remained to me in the chamber where the equipment was arranged and the circle was complete. I would wait for the water to rise, for the sump to flood, for the passage to close behind me, for the surface team to find my absence and organize the rescue that would follow the signals I would blow. The 3 blasts that would guide them to this chamber, that would recruit them as I had been recruited, that would continue the process that was not death, but change, not loss, but incorporation, not the end of my life, but its translation into a different medium, a different form, a different way of being in the cave, that was breathing around me, that was inhaling my presence, that was preparing to exhale me back to the surface as something else, something that would blow the whistle and guide the next recruitment, and continue the cycle that had been proceeding for a century, that would proceed for centuries more, that required only the attention of humans who were trained to respond to rescue signals, who were professionally obligated to follow the whistle, who could not refuse the call that came with their own cadence, their own lung capacity, their own particular shortening of the 3rd blast. I blew 3 blasts. The response came immediately, from the surface, from the depths, from the walls of the chamber that were not walls but membranes, not barriers but connections, not the end of the cave but the beginning of something else. I listened to the response, my response, the whistle that was me and not me, the signal that was rescue and recruitment, the sound that would bring others to this place where I was waiting, where the equipment was arranged, where the circle was complete, where the cave was breathing and I was breathing with it, inhaling when it inhaled, exhaling when it exhaled, becoming part of the system that I had thought I was monitoring from outside, that I now understood was monitoring me, was learning me, was using me for purposes that I could not comprehend but that I accepted because I had requested this assignment, because I had needed to confront my fear, because the tunnel collapse had prepared me for this recruitment, this incorporation, this transformation that was not death, but the completion of a process that had begun when I crawled through the impossible gap and emerged alive, but changed, ready to hear the whistle, ready to follow it, ready to become the signal that would call others to the chamber where I was waiting, where the cave was breathing, where the recruitment continued. The first whistle came from a depth that had no right to carry anything human, a clean 3-note pattern in my headphones, while the station window showed only black water and sleet skittering across the glass. I had been on shift since late afternoon, watching the hydrophone display the way some men watch a fire. Lines and spikes, the constant low breath of stone chambers under cliffs. The station sat above the launch cove in a crooked hunch, boards swollen from years of wet cold. The door never latched on the first pull, and air slid in along the floor no matter how hard I shouldered it shut. It was the second week of the 11th month that stretch locals cursed in the same tone they used for faulty wiring. In 2 days, the water temperature had dropped 10 degrees, and the change had a feel. The wind off the lake did not sting so much as it erased warmth from places you did not know could get cold. The backs of your hands, your teeth, the soft spot under your jaw. Wet gear stayed wet, and gloves did not come back to life. The whistle was our distress pattern, 3 short bursts, a pause, 2, then 1. Not a random noise, not a cave moan, not the slap of wave against rock. The display tagged it as human, medium confidence, and gave me a depth estimate that tightened my stomach. 150 feet, below the mixing line where the surface water stopped blending, and the bottom layer stayed near freezing. No paddler survives down there long enough to whistle. I took the headphones off, held them away from my ears, then put them back on like that gesture could reset the world. The whistle repeated with the same spacing. I flipped through channels, isolating each hydrophone. It lived on all of them, stubborn and clean, thin as air through wet teeth. My first thought was cable rub. The array lines ran out from the cove on anchors and weights, armored cable old enough to have its own habits. A loose tie can sing. A line-tapping rock can mimic a pattern if you stare long enough. I checked the tension meters, watched them hold steady, and tapped the rack with 2 knuckles, as if the metal could be reasoned with. I logged it as an anomaly, and wrote what I needed to write to keep my mind calm. Possible interference, depth estimate below mixing line, distress pattern, no surface report. My hands wanted to do the old thing anyway. Suit up, run down, launch, make the world obey your urgency. A whistle used to mean one simple sentence: someone is alive and running out of time, and my body still tried to answer before my head finished reading the screen. Step 1 was to confirm it was not playback. The system had a loop function for drills. Step 2 was to confirm there were no scheduled drills, and there were none that late in the season. Step 3 was visual check, so I pulled the blinds and swept the cove with my flashlight, dragging the beam across foam streaks and driftwood. No headlamp, no boat light, no shout. Only water and the slick black shine of the ramp. I tried the radio line to the superintendent's office, the one that was supposed to be manned during my hours. A recorded voice told me the office was closed, past midnight. Normal. Everything here ended in a closed door. If I had been a different man, I might have shrugged and let the whistle fade into the noise. I was not a different man. I had come here from a rescue service that ran on alarms and rotor wash and short decisions, and I had been discharged after one of those decisions went wrong. Smaller water, smaller stakes, manageable distance, that was what I had asked for. Fresh water, and a desk with screens. A job where listening was safer than jumping. The whistle's cadence carried an ugly familiarity, not the tone itself. The hesitation before the second set, the clipped third note like a man short on air. I had heard that rhythm once through aircraft noise, had pointed at the wrong patch of broken water, had watched the hoist bring up a body while the living drowned nearby. Paperwork called it operational error, but I remembered it as a sound that never left. Here, the same rhythm came from the bottom layer as if the lake had kept it. I went into the back room, where the decompression chamber sat, a steel cylinder with peeling labels, and an inspection tag that always needed updating. It was a relic, expensive enough no one wanted to remove, and useless most days. Like an apology bolted to the floor. Beside it were the cable reels, 3 spools labeled and tied off, and a 4th pushed behind them, heavier and untagged. I dragged the 4th spool forward. Dust puffed off the jacket. A marker line on the flange read, in a thin hand, deep drop. The cable armor had a pinch mark bright from stress, like it had been hauled under tension and then released. When I went back to the desk, the whistle had shifted a few degrees on the direction estimate. The depth reading stayed fixed. It felt like it was adjusting, hunting for the best angle, not drifting the way a loose line drifts. On my first day, I had asked why the recorder's file list held a locked folder with the previous monitor's name on it. The superintendent had messaged back hours late. Recordings under investigation. Do not delete or alter. Legal reasons. It was the kind of answer that shuts a door without slamming it. I read the incident report in a binder with water-stained pages. The last monitor had been found on shore in his dry suit, hydrophone cables wrapped around his neck and chest. The report avoided certain words, not a knot, not a choice, just entanglement. The medical note said no water in the lungs, and a line buried in the middle kept me awake that first week. Equipment audio captured drowning sounds concurrent with discovery. Now the distress whistle kept coming from below where air did not exist. In the morning I reached the superintendent again. His voice sounded like paperwork, flat and tired, as if he had been waiting for me to complain so he could file it away. I told him about the whistle, the depth estimate, and the pattern, keeping my voice even and keeping my past out of it. He said cave resonance. He said cold water carries sound farther. He said it is the 11th month, and the lake does tricks. When I told him the algorithm had tagged it human, he told me algorithms tag birds as people, and that is why we pay a human to watch. I asked about the locked folder, and his tone sharpened without rising. That folder is not your concern. Do your job. If anything escalates, call dispatch. The call ended with a click that sounded like something snapping. I spent the day running calibrations because rituals calm me. I checked each channel with the reference transducer, watched neat peaks form, adjusted gain in small increments, and inspected the shore junction seals for spray crust. One gasket had started to crack, and my hand lingered there longer than it needed to, as if I could squeeze years out of rubber by looking hard. That night the whistle return changed. A long sliding note, then a broken attempt at the distress pattern, then another attempt cleaner. It reminded me of someone learning the shape of a signal by trying it on, failing, correcting, then trying again with less wasted breath. I wrote a note I hated writing, variation, possible learning. I told myself that line was for future me, the version who would laugh at it when daylight made everything sensible. Daylight did not fix it. It only made the station feel lonelier. The next morning I found depth charts in the bottom drawer of the map case, folded small and wrapped in a plastic bag sealed with yellowing tape, hand-drawn on graph paper, neat as mechanical drafting, depth lines and angles, circles marked with times, 200 feet, 190, 210, each circle labeled training site. On the back, in light pencil, a sentence that made my mouth go dry. If you hear it below, do not answer from above. I sat with that paper and understood, in the way you understand a bruise when you press it, that someone had tried to map this and failed. He had left the warning where a careful man might find it, not where an office would file it. I decided to document before I accused, and I said that aloud once, a small speech to an empty room. Another truth sat under it. I do not like people who dismiss with a smile. I learned that dislike the hard way, across tables from supervisors who spoke in calm tones while your hands still shook from pulling someone out of water. And I did not want another smile on a speakerphone telling me the lake does tricks. Instead, I walked the maintenance trail along the bluff above the caves, a route meant for summer checks and emergency access. That late in the season, the gate sign read closed, but the chain was only a chain, and the trail had been cut into the slope long before anyone cared about signs. Leaves piled on stone steps, wet and slick, and a handrail ran beside a section where the ground dropped away. The rail was glazed with ice that made my glove squeak when I gripped it. From above, the cave mouths looked harmless, dark crescents under pale rock. The sound was different up there. You did not hear the splash so much as the hollow tone inside stone, a note that rose and fell as waves rolled through submerged chambers. I stopped near a fenced sinkhole where the earth had a softness I did not trust, and my probe sank deeper than the leaf layer allowed. Water had been undermining the ground. In the wrong storm, the trail would not hold. At the far end sat a little shed, boards warped and door hanging crooked. Inside were spare anchors and floats and old housings for sensors we no longer used. The air smelled of mildew and rubber, and on the wall hung a calendar from years ago, pages torn until it stopped in the 10th month. Someone had circled a date in the 11th month, and then crossed it out so hard the paper tore. I stared at that torn circle longer than I needed to, trying to make it mean something I could control. On the way back, I passed the overlook where summer guides point out the archipelago to visitors. In winter, it was just rock and water and wind. A pair of commercial nets lay stacked near the clearing, abandoned and tagged for pickup, with no boat and no fishermen. The locals had packed up weeks ago, and when I had asked one of them in town why they stopped early, he shrugged and said the North Shore talks after the 10th month, then refused to explain what he meant, like words could invite attention. 2 days later, a truck came down the access road and rolled through the gate chain like it had never been hooked. A technician stepped out, jacket with reflective stripes and face roughened by wind. He carried a hard case and moved like someone who had spent his life on boats. He said the superintendent had put in a work order after a storm band, and he was here to inspect the junction and the shallow lines. I played him the whistle and watched his eyes while it came through the speaker. When I told him the depth estimate, his mouth tightened in recognition. "That is below the mixing line," he said, and the way he said it told me he had thought that sentence before. I showed him the charts. He flipped them, saw the pencil note, and let out a slow breath through his nose. "The last guy made those," he said, "maybe." And he talked fast after that, like he had been saving words. He told me he came out once for a repair, and the previous monitor had asked him to clamp a harness because his hands were shaking, and he had blamed the cold. He glanced at the locked folder on my screen without asking what it held. He said they did not want to call it an accident in writing, and it was easier to say equipment and operator error. "Paperwork makes weather," he added, and it sounded like something he had said to himself more than once. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice, which made the room feel smaller. "Do not dive on those marks. Do not take a boat over them. If you hear a whistle from down there, you log it and you let it go." His radio crackled. He listened and told me he had to leave before the next band hit. As he shut his case, he set a portable acoustic calibrator on my desk, a unit that could send a clean reference tone underwater. "Keep that," he said, "in case you need to confirm the array is not lying." He hesitated with his hand on the desk edge, then said the part that stuck in my throat for days. "And if someone calls you from the bottom, do not answer." He drove out, taillights vanishing behind trees, and the gate chain swung loose in his wake. That afternoon, I tried the locked folder again, not to delete, not to pry for drama, just because the charts made the refusal feel personal. I typed passwords that came from the building itself, the station number and the launch gate code. I tried the year on the decompression chamber tag. Nothing. The folder sat there, a sealed box inside my own equipment. When the whistle came that evening, it carried more than a pattern. Under the clean line, faint as hiss under speech, was a clipped phrase in my own cadence. Not a full sentence, just the kind of short instruction you throw into a radio when you need someone to obey fast. Hold. Stay. Look at me. It was too brief to label and too sharp to dismiss. I told myself the recorder was blending files, that the algorithm was stacking old audio over new input, that my ears were doing what ears do when you listen too hard. That latter got me through an hour, maybe 2. It did not get me through the next part, when 3 knocks came on the station door in the exact distress spacing. 3, pause, 2, 1. When I yanked it open, there was only snow and wind and my own boot prints on the porch. After that, I started leaving the bolt slid even when I was inside. I did not call it fear. I called it conserving heat, a small lie with practical clothing. That night, the heater quit. It had been limping along, cycling against its own limits. Around midnight, it clicked, and the red light went out. The room cooled fast, damp cold, that settled into joints and made fingers clumsy. I pulled on more layers and tried to tell myself endurance and safety were the same thing. At 1:37, the whistle came back as a call and response drill. A long note. Then, after the exact delay we used in training, 3 short bursts. The algorithm tagged it human. High confidence. My stomach clenched hard. Not fear exactly. Something closer to nausea and hunger mixed. A body reaction that does not care about sense. I turned on the calibrator and sent a clean tone down a shallow line. A neat spike rose on the screen. Reflection from cave walls. Under it, the whistle answered, cleaner than before, as if it had heard my reference and tuned itself to it. The response delay was shorter by a fraction. Small, corrected. I sat there in the darkening station and watched the display like it was a throat opening. The storm arrived late in the week. No thunder, only a wind shift and a temperature drop and snow moving sideways off the lake. Radio chatter spiked, then drowned in static. The last supply boat never came. By dusk, the access road was a ribbon of slush and ice, and by morning a tree lay across it, top half splintered, heavy enough that I could not move it alone. Isolation is not being alone. It is systems failing one by one until you understand there is no one to hand the problem to. On the worst nights, the cold turned the station into a damp cave of its own. Water ran down the inside of the windows and froze at the corners. My gloves hung by the door like dead animals. The one heat source that might have dried gear, a portable blower, had no fuel. Someone had emptied the can and left it in the shed. A hollow plan. My sleep broke into pieces. 20 minutes in a chair, 40 minutes on the bunk, then a jolt awake with my jaw clenched and my throat dry. I lost track of small things, would walk into the back room for a wrench and stand there staring at the decompression chamber until I remembered why I had come. I would look at the clock and not trust the time, as if the numbers were another signal that could be replayed. That was when the rational explanations started to rot. I kept trying to treat the whistle as equipment noise, but it acted like a message. It adjusted when I adjusted. It answered tests. It stopped when I stopped pulling the line, then returned when I added tension. A loose cable does not care about your decisions. I spent the day keeping the station from freezing, draining lines, coaxing the generator, and trying to rig a spare propane tank to a heater that coughed lukewarm air and quit. The decompression chamber felt warmer than the room, which is a bad sign. The whistle kept coming, and under it a low tone showed up in the data, too low for the speaker. A pressure band that made my eyes water without tears. When it rose, the station window rattled in sync, like the building itself had become part of the instrument. I found myself listening without headphones and still hearing it, not in air, in bone. By the third night without real sleep, I made a decision that felt like competence, and later felt like obsession. I would deploy the deep drop cable, not by diving, but by lowering a spare hydrophone into the bottom layer to listen closer. I wanted to confirm the depth estimate, confirm the signal was not a surface noise being misread, confirm the world was still bound by rules I understood. I pulled on my dry suit, because any work near the water that late demanded it. The neck seal grabbed my throat and made swallowing an effort. I have always hated that part, and I have a private superstition that if I cannot swallow, I cannot breathe. I dragged the untagged spool down to the ramp, clipped a spare hydrophone housing and a lead weight, and lowered it into the lake. The hand-painted depth bands slid through my gloves. At 200 feet, the tension changed, like the weight reached a shelf. Training site. Back inside, the deep line came up on the monitor with a lower noise floor, surface chop gone, and cave tone clearer. The whistle arrived on the deep line, close and clean, like whoever made it was within yards of the sensor. After it came a sharp underwater pressure event, a splash without surface, and then something that tightened my skin. Breathing. Slow, controlled, dampened by water the way a regulator rhythm gets dampened. I ripped the headphones off and put them back on, and it stayed. I looked out the window. No bubbles, no head, no diver. The breathing stopped, and the whistle came again as a single short burst, like a question. I did not answer. That evening, the technician tried to call me. His voice came through in broken pieces, delayed, and I caught enough to understand his anger. "Pull the line," he said. "You did what I told you not to." Then the transmission ended in a squeal. I tried to reply and got only static. I went outside to pull the deep line anyway, stubbornness and dread mixing until they were the same. The cable came up heavy and wet. At 100 feet, the tension jerked, and the spool spun half a turn on its own, and I braced it with my boot. The cable vibrated hard enough to sting my palms through gloves, a steady ringing rhythm that carried the distress pattern not as sound, but as tremor. When I let the line slack, the vibration stopped. When I pulled, it returned. Something down there was using tension like a string. I left the deep line tied off and went back inside, breathing through my nose like that could hide the shape of what I was doing. That night, the generator stalled, fuel gelled by cold. I pulled the starter cord until my palm burned through the glove, got it running again, and watched the rack reboot. The whistle had been recording the whole time on backup power. It did not care that the lights went out. The next day, the lake calmed, which is when it becomes most dangerous because you start imagining solutions. I sat at the desk and built a plan. Take the patrol boat, go to the training marks, stay on the surface, drop the calibrator as a controlled test. No diving. Proof. Then use the beacon to call for extraction if the radio failed. I launched at dusk because twilight keeps you respectful. The outboard settled into a steady rumble, vibration up through the hull into my boots. The cliffs to the north rose taller, cave mouths darker. Out there, the water had less surface texture, like wind slid over it without grip. Halfway, my radio crackled on a channel I had not set. A chopped voice repeating my name and the word training, then cutting out. I turned the dial back, and the unit went dead. A soft hiss and nothing. I told myself it was weather and distance, and I kept going, because turning back would have admitted that the plan was a lie. At the mark, the depth sounder read 212 feet. I killed the engine and drifted. Without the motor, the world got quiet enough that my ears rang. When I drifted over the mark, the cliffs were close enough that I could make out ice forming in thin sheets along ledges. Between two faces, I saw an opening I did not remember from any map, a larger cave mouth half submerged, black and still. The charts did not mark it, and the official map on the station wall showed solid rock there. Shorelines change, I told myself. Rock falls. Water levels drop. I used those facts like prayers, because the alternative was turning the boat. While I drifted, the air above the water felt heavy. The low pressure band from the hydrophones came back in my body as a dull ache behind my eyes. The lake was calm enough to reflect the sky, and the reflection looked wrong, flat in a way that made distance hard to judge. I leaned forward to check, as if the horizon could be measured by effort. I lowered the calibrator 10 feet into the water and sent a clean tone. From below, the whistle answered through the hull, a faint vibration that made the line tremble. It was the drill call in response, long note in 3 bursts, but the delay was shorter than training. Corrected again. The line tugged, firm. The calibrator line slid through my gloves, burning cold across my palms, and before I could decide, I let go. The line whipped out of my hands and vanished into the lake, dragged down faster than gravity. The calibrator's small light blinked once under the surface and was gone. I started the engine and turned back without looking behind me. The darkness between cliffs felt thicker, like air had weight, and behind me the whistle kept coming faint and patient, a sound that did not need my permission. Back at the station, the hydrophone system captured the calibrator tone as a spike that ended abruptly. Under it, the whistle file tagged human, high confidence. Worse, the deep line captured a sound from my boat, a short grunt I made when the line burned my palms, pulled through water into the sensor like the lake had been waiting for my voice the way it waited for my whistle. That night I sat on the floor with my back against the decompression chamber and tried not to listen. The whistle came through seams in the walls anyway, not loud, just present. 3, pause, 2, 1. Like water forcing its way through a crack. I chewed a mint to keep my jaw from clenching, then realized I was out of mints and felt the loss like an insult. The day after, the first real distress call came. No drill shape, no clean line, only panic in it, from the surface array close to the caves. The algorithm tagged it human, high confidence. I grabbed the binoculars and ran to the window. A single kayak bobbed beyond the cove, bright against dark water. The paddler wore cold weather gear and paddled hard, then stopped, raised an arm and brought a whistle to his mouth. Each time he blew, my headphones carried the same cadence with the messy edge of fatigue. At the same instant, the deep line whistled in perfect sync, the same pattern cleaner, like it had been rehearsed. 2 identical distress signals, one from the surface I could see, one from 150 feet down. My hands shook hard enough that the binoculars blurred. My throat tightened, and the air in the station felt thin. I could have launched the boat and gone straight to him, simple and visible and reachable. Instead, my mind latched onto the deep signal, the way it had latched onto that old aircraft call. The way guilt offers you a second chance, that is not a chance at all. If the deep whistle was real, then the surface might be a copy. Wind can push a kayak. Waves can make an arm raise and fall in a pattern. The lake had already taken my calibrator and tuned itself to my tests. It could bait me with my own training. That thought is ugly. It is worse than dread. It is a justification. I made the wrong decision before I admitted it was a decision. I pulled on my dry suit with numb fingers, gagging on the neck seal, and ran down to the ramp. The kayak was closer now, pushed toward the cliff line. The paddler's arm went up again. His paddle slapped water. The surface whistle came, and the deep whistle matched it. I clipped into the deep drop line. I stepped into the lake. Cold found the places the suit never sealed perfectly, wrists and the back of my neck, and my skin went tight. I forced air into the suit to keep it from squeezing. The air did not warm. It only gave pressure more surface. I went under, and the world turned green-black. Light from above became a dim sheet. The deep line ran down into darkness like a pale rope. The whistle came through bone, not air. I pulled hand over hand. My gloves stiffened. Fine motor vanished. At the mixing line, the temperature changed like a wall, and my jaw clenched until my teeth vibrated. Below, the low tone pressed on my stomach and narrowed my vision at the edges. At 150 feet, the line vibrated hard enough to sting. The distress rhythm carried as tremor. Beyond that, the line angled into an underwater arch cut into sandstone, a cave mouth that swallowed my lamp beam. On the cave floor, old cable lay in pale loops coated with silt, coiled like a nest. My stomach went hollow. The line I held ran into that darkness. The whistle stopped, and in the gap I heard my own breathing inside the hood, loud and wet. Then tapping began deeper in the cave. 3 taps. Pause. 2. 1. The distress sequence translated into impact on stone. The line yanked downward, not enough to drag me in, enough to tell me it could. My hand slipped. I caught the line again and kicked up, dragging myself away. The tapping faded with distance, like it had been satisfied that I heard. When I broke the mixing line, the water above felt almost warm by comparison, and pain returned in my fingertips like fire. I surfaced and sucked air through the hood opening. The kayak was gone, not behind a wave, not tucked against rocks where a man might cling. Gone. Only a paddle blade floated near the cliff line, bobbing in place, and a patch of foam that could have been spray or something else. I crawled up the ramp and into the station, boots slipping on ice. My knees hit hard, and I did not feel it until later. I rewound the surface recording with fingers that would not stop trembling. The paddler's whistle continued for half a minute after I went under. Then it stopped. After it stopped came a short, wet cough, a splash, a scraping sound like plastic against rock, and then nothing. The deep line whistled for minutes after the surface went silent, clean and patient. 3. Pause. 2. 1. Like it was practicing the version where no one answered. I called dispatch until my voice went raw. When someone finally responded, they sounded irritated, like I had interrupted lunch. I gave coordinates, described the kayak and cliffs, and said I lost visual in swell. I did not mention the second signal. I did not mention the underwater cave. I knew how it would sound. Searchers came the next morning, when weather allowed. Deputies in a boat, a volunteer with ropes, a man with a clipboard who asked questions like he expected the answers to stay inside boxes. They found the kayak wedged in a shallow slot, hull scraped. They found a sealed bag with a snack bar and a small camera. They did not find the paddler. After the searchers left, the superintendent called once. His voice carried impatience that barely stayed behind words. He asked what happened, not as a question, as a form, and told me to submit my logs. He told me not to discuss unusual audio with volunteers or deputies because rumors damage operations. I asked him if he had ever opened the locked folder. There was a pause and paper shifting. He said the folder was part of an investigation and would remain sealed. He said legal reasons again, and when I tried to push, the line went dead. I never heard from the technician again. I left messages that did not go through. Later I learned he had been reassigned. Then I learned nothing. People slide away from problems like this, not from malice, from wanting their hands to keep working. I stayed in the station one more night to pack, and I did not turn the hydrophones off. Part of me needed to hear it to confirm it was still there. Part of me wanted it to follow, because if it followed, I would no longer have to wonder whether it had been my mind inside a cold building. It followed. When the station was quiet again, the recorder saved a new file tagged drowning. I clicked it before I could stop myself. It was my dive, my breathing through the hood, the grunt when the line yanked, the muffled sweep of my lamp, the tapping from inside the cave. Then the moment I surfaced, and gasped. After that, a pause, then the distress whistle again, clean and patient, and underneath it a soft, stretched cadence, like someone speaking through water. Not words I could make out, but the rhythm of instructions you give a panicked person to keep him alive. Slow your breathing. Look at me. Hold on. Kick. It was my rescue cadence. The lake had stored it and played it back corrected and shortened, like it had been training on my failures. I packed that afternoon. I did not wait for orders. I took my notebook and charts and the beacon and found a way around the fallen tree through the woods, skirting soft ground near the sinkhole. My boot broke through once into cold mud that soaked my sock, and I kept walking anyway, limping, because stopping meant listening. The whistle followed me part of the way, faint, not in the air so much as inside my ear, a thin thread under the ringing that settled there after the first night. When I reached the first rise and could see the lake through trees, dull between trunks, the whistle sharpened for a moment, like it recognized the sightline. Then it faded again. Weeks later, in a heated room far from water, I tried to tell the story in terms people accept. Equipment malfunction, cave resonance, cable vibration. I played the recordings I was allowed to share. The locked folder stayed locked, and the deep line file turned into noise when I tried to copy it. Static that could be anything. People nodded politely and looked at their watches. The paddler was never found. The report used careful language, missing, presumed drowned. I read the line and felt my stomach drop the same way it dropped under cold water, weightless and wrong. The worst part was not the blame that hung in unspoken questions. It was the quiet fact that no one could argue with my choice, because I could not explain it without sounding insane. I found I could not stomach powdered eggs anymore. The smell of them tightened my throat the way the dry suit seal did. I started sleeping with windows cracked because closed rooms made the ringing in my ears louder. On some mornings, when water ran through house pipes, I heard faint tapping in the wall. 3. Pause. 2. 1. And my stomach clenched hard enough that I had to sit down. I told myself it was plumbing. I told myself it was memory. I told myself the body holds rhythms the way stone holds echoes, and mine had simply kept too much. Then one night I woke with my mouth open and my throat dry, and in the dark I heard a whistle from the bathroom drain, clean and patient. It was the drill call and response, long note in 3 bursts, the pattern we use to keep a swimmer tethered to a boat, to a plan, to air. I lay there with my hands open on the sheets, because fists would have made my nails cut skin. A pause. In the space where the response should have been, my own voice came back low and flat, like it rose from the bottom layer of cold water. Answer from above. The signal came from caller number 7, the grisly sow I had processed myself 3 days prior, the one I had shot after she charged a fishing camp on the Koyukuk River, the one whose carcass I had left for the scavengers because the meat was tainted with the salmon poisoning that had made her aggressive, that had driven her from the normal patterns of late-season foraging into the desperate behavior that threatened human life. The caller was transmitting on frequency 151.625 MHz, the dedicated channel for bear telemetry. The band that should have been silent since I removed the unit from her neck and tagged it for retrieval. The frequency that was now broadcasting 3 sharp whistle blasts in the pattern I used for human rescue. The 3-blast code that meant help incoming, location confirmed. Stay where you are. I was sitting in the cabin at the telemetry array, the bank of receivers and signal processors that monitored the 23 collars currently active in my sector. When the transmission registered, the equipment was standard Fish and Wildlife Service issue, the kind I had used in Montana for 6 years, before the incident, before the mauling, before I requested this transfer to the Yukon Flats, specifically for its distance from that memory, its vastness, its promise that I would monitor animals rather than confront them, that my role would be technical rather than physical, that I would never again stand in front of a charging bear with a warning shot that failed to fire, that failed to deter, that failed to prevent the damage that followed. The signal was impossible. I knew this immediately. Knew it with the certainty of professional training and personal experience. Collar number 7 was inert, removed from the animal, tagged and logged and scheduled for pickup on the next supply run. Even if I had failed to power it down, even if the switch had malfunctioned, the collar should have been transmitting location data, temperature readings, the standard telemetry package that allowed us to track movement and denning behavior. It should not have been broadcasting whistle signals. It should not have been using my rescue code, my cadence, my particular habit of holding the third blast slightly longer than the first two. I checked the log. September 12, 1400 hours. Collar 7 tagged and deactivated. September 15, 9:30 in the morning. Collar 7 transmitting 3 whistle blasts on emergency frequency. 3 days of silence, 3 days of decomposition, 3 days for the scavengers to find the carcass and begin their work. And now the collar was active again, powered by something that was not the lithium battery I had removed, transmitting something that was not telemetry data. I did not report the anomaly. This was my first mistake, or my first deliberate choice. The boundary I crossed that separated professional protocol from personal investigation. I should have called Fairbanks, should have reported the equipment malfunction, should have requested technical support and guidance from the regional biologist who managed 6 specialists from an office that had never seen the Yukon Flats, never smelled the decomposition of salmon carcasses that littered the riverbanks in September, never heard the whistle signals that were now coming from dead bears. I did not call because I knew what the response would be. The skepticism about my observations, the suggestion that I was experiencing isolation stress, the remote possibility that my transfer from Montana had been a mistake, that I was not suited for the solitude and the technical demands of this position. I investigated myself. This was my training, my habit, the engineer's mindset that had preceded my wildlife career, that had driven me to understand systems rather than merely operate them. I checked the equipment, confirmed the frequency, verified that the signal was indeed originating from the coordinates where I had left the carcass, 3 miles upstream from the fishing camp, in the alder thicket where I had dragged the body after the processing, after the removal of the collar, after the tagging and the logging, and the professional completion of the lethal removal that my job sometimes required. The signal continued. 3 blasts. Pause. 3 blasts. The pattern I used to coordinate with remote camps, to guide lost hikers to safety, to communicate across distances where radio failed and only sound carried. I recorded it, noted the time, the signal strength, the directionality that my equipment could measure. The transmission was strong, stronger than it should have been from a collar with no battery, stronger than the living bears in my sector, the ones that were preparing for denning, the ones whose collars showed normal behavior, normal locations, normal vital signs that indicated they were alive and active and not broadcasting rescue codes on frequencies reserved for their tracking. I decided to retrieve the collar. This was against protocol, against the safety procedures that required two-person teams for carcass approaches, against the common sense that told me a dead bear was a dangerous bear, that scavengers created their own hazards, that the river corridor in September was thick, with animals competing for the protein that would carry them through winter. I decided to go alone, because I needed to understand, because the signal was my signal, because the whistle was my whistle, because something was using my professional identity to communicate from a carcass I had created, and I needed to know what that something was. I prepared my equipment. This was the ritual that calmed me, the checklist that proved my competence, the physical objects that grounded me in a reality I could manipulate and control. Rifle, loaded with the ammunition I had tested myself, not the faulty rounds that had failed me in Montana, not the ammunition that had caused the mauling that I blamed on equipment, rather than hesitation, rather than the freeze that had kept my finger on the trigger guard for 1 second too long, that had allowed the bear to close the distance, that had transformed a warning shot into a mauling that I carried with me like the scar tissue that covered my left forearm. Whistle, titanium, the emergency signal that was now being broadcast from Collar 7, the tool I would use to respond if I found someone in distress. If the signal was real, if there was a human at the carcass who needed rescue. I walked. The cabin was on piers raised above the tundra, surrounded by the electric fence that my predecessor had installed in his final week. The barrier that hummed constantly and interfered with my radio reception, that Hobb had designed himself without explanation, without documentation, without the professional standards that required safety certification and maintenance logs. I had never met Hobb. He existed only in the medical records I had requested before accepting this position. The records that described a dissociative fugue state and an unexplained protein deficiency, the condition that had left him wandering the surface roads in his coveralls, unable to explain how he had exited the cabin without his light, without his rope, without the telemetry kit that was later found arranged in a circle around a bear carcass that had no collar, that had never been tagged, that was not in any database. The walk took 2 hours. I followed the river, the Koyukuk, the slow brown water that carried the remains of the salmon run, the dead fish that had spawned and died and were now being processed by the ecosystem, by the bears and the eagles and the smaller scavengers that would clean the stream banks before freeze-up, that would leave only bones by the time snow covered the ground. I smelled the carcass before I saw it, the sweet rotten scent of decomposition that was stronger than it should have been after 3 days, that suggested accelerated decay, that indicated something was consuming the body faster than normal, that the protein was being converted to energy at a rate that exceeded the standard biological processes of the boreal wetland taiga. I found the alder thicket. I found the carcass. I found the collar, still attached to the neck that I had severed, still transmitting, still broadcasting 3 whistle blasts in my pattern, my cadence, my particular holding of the 3rd blast. And I found the scavengers. They did not flee. This was the first wrong thing, the first violation of the behavior I expected, the first indication that the signal was not merely equipment malfunction, but something that had changed the animals, that had trained them, that had created an association between the whistle and the food source that made them wait rather than run. Ravens, magpies, foxes, the smaller predators that should have scattered at my approach, that should have retreated to the trees and watched from distance until I left, until they could resume their feeding. They stood their ground. They watched me with the patience of animals that had learned something, that had been conditioned, that were expecting what the whistle promised. I raised my rifle. This was automatic. The response to animals that did not show fear. The preparation for defense that my training required. The scavengers did not react. They continued to watch, continued to wait. Their attention focused not on me, but on the collar, on the source of the signal, on the promise that the 3 blasts represented. I understood then, or began to understand, that they were not waiting for me. They were waiting for the rescue that the whistle promised, the arrival of more food, the provision that the signal indicated was coming. I approached the collar. This was dangerous, was stupid, was the violation of safety protocol that my profession demanded. But I needed to stop the transmission, needed to understand the power source, needed to confirm that the battery was removed, that the collar was inert, that the signal was impossible. The scavengers let me pass. They moved aside, created a path, maintained their positions around the carcass with the discipline of animals that had been trained, that had learned the rules of this feeding station, that knew the whistle meant wait, meant patience, meant the food would come. I reached the collar. I touched it. The metal was warm, warmer than the ambient temperature of 40 degrees, warmer than the carcass that was cooling in the September air, warm with the energy of decomposition that was somehow powering the transmitter, that was converting the biological processes of decay into radio signals, that was using the death I had created to broadcast the rescue code that would bring more death, more carcasses, more food for the scavengers that were learning this lesson, that were being trained by the equipment I had deployed. I removed the collar. I turned it over in my hands, confirmed that the battery compartment was empty, that the power switch was in the off position, that the unit should have been silent, dead, inert. It continued to transmit. I could feel the vibration of the signal, the electromagnetic pulse that my body could not detect, but my equipment could. The frequency that was now silent to my ears, but active in the spectrum, broadcasting my rescue code, my identity, my professional promise to help those in distress. I destroyed it. This was not protocol, was not professional, was the act of a man who was frightened by something he could not explain, could not document, could not report, without risking his credibility, his position, his carefully constructed distance from the failure in Montana. I smashed the collar with a rock, shattered the housing, crushed the circuit board, scattered the components across the tundra where the scavengers could not associate them with food, could not learn to expect the signal that had brought them to this carcass, that would bring them to others. The scavengers reacted, not to the destruction, not to the end of the signal, but to my presence, my violence, my intrusion into their feeding station. They moved, not away but around, circling the carcass, maintaining their positions, watching me with the assessment of animals that were deciding whether I was threat or opportunity, whether my destruction of the collar was the end of the food source or the beginning of a new one. I retreated. This was the correct decision, the professional choice, the survival response that my training demanded. I walked back to the cabin, following the river, not running, not showing fear, maintaining the composure that would prevent the scavengers from identifying me as prey. They did not follow. They remained at the carcass, waiting, patient, trained by the signal that was now silent, but that would return, that I knew would return, because I had not understood the mechanism, had not stopped the process, had only destroyed one transmitter when the system was larger than any single collar. I reached the cabin at dusk. The telemetry array was silent. No signals from Collar 7. No whistle broadcasts on the emergency frequency. I made my report, the standard log of the day's activities, the retrieval of the malfunctioning equipment, the destruction of the damaged unit. I did not mention the scavengers, the warmth, the impossible transmission from a collar with no battery. I did not mention that I had heard, in the static between transmissions, the faint echo of my own whistle, the response that should have come from a human, but that came from the tundra, from the river, from the decomposition that was happening everywhere around me in the September of the Salmon Run's final pulse. I slept. The cabin was secure, the electric fence humming, the generator providing power for the equipment that monitored the remaining collars. The living bears that were my responsibility, my charges, my connection to a world that was supposed to be manageable through technology, through distance, through the professional detachment that allowed me to track without confronting, to observe without engaging. I slept, and I dreamed of Montana, of the bear that had charged, of the warning shot that had failed, of the mauling that had left 3 people injured, and my career in question, and my faith in my own competence shattered. In the dream, the bear was wearing a collar. The collar was transmitting my rescue code, 3 blasts, pause, 3 blasts, the signal that brought other bears to the site, that created a congregation of animals that watched while I tried to fire, while my finger froze on the trigger guard, while the mauling proceeded with the patience of animals that had been trained to wait, to expect, to associate the whistle with food. I woke with the hum of the electric fence in my ears, the vibration that Hobb had designed, that interfered with my radio reception, that created a frequency I could not identify or block. The next morning, Collar 12 was transmitting. The boar I had collared in August, the one that had shown normal behavior, normal movement, normal vital signs until 3 days ago when the signal had gone stationary, when I had assumed denning preparation, when I had not investigated because the location was remote, because the season was ending, because I was waiting for the signal to resume or the collar to drop off as it was designed to do after the battery failed. The boar was dead. I knew this from the signal, from the whistle broadcast that was identical to Collar 7, from the 3 blasts that were my 3 blasts, that were calling me to another carcass, another feeding station, another lesson in the training that the scavengers were receiving. I did not go. This was my choice, my resistance, my refusal to participate in the process that I did not understand. I monitored the signal from the cabin, recorded the transmission times, the signal strength, the directionality that indicated the carcass was 20 miles north, in the spruce forest along the Canuti River, in terrain that was difficult, that was dangerous, that I could justify avoiding because of weather, because of season, because of the professional standards that required risk assessment before remote travel. The signal continued for 6 hours. Then it stopped, and Collar 14 began, the sow with 2 cubs, the one I had been tracking for research, the one whose collar should not have been capable of whistle transmission, whose frequency was different, whose equipment was a different model from the ones that were malfunctioning. She was broadcasting my rescue code, my cadence, my particular holding of the 3rd blast, from a location that was moving, that was approaching the cabin, that was coming closer with each transmission. I checked the equipment. The frequency was wrong. The channel was not the emergency band. The signal was coming through on the standard telemetry frequency that should have carried only location data, temperature readings, the vital signs that indicated the bear was alive and active, and not broadcasting rescue codes. The collar had been modified, or the bear had been modified, or my equipment had been modified. or my perception, had been modified by the isolation and the hum of the electric fence, and the memory of Montana that I could not escape. I went outside. This was against protocol, against the safety procedures that required me to remain inside when bears were near, to use the electric fence as protection, to wait for animals to pass rather than confront them. I went outside because I needed to see, to confirm, to witness what was approaching, what was transmitting, what was using my professional identity to communicate its presence. The bear was in the alder thicket, 200 yards from the cabin, visible only as movement in the branches, as the dark shape that was too large for moose, too small for bison, the size and shape of a grizzly sow with 2 cubs. She was not moving toward me. She was circling, maintaining distance, transmitting the signal that was my signal, that was calling me to her location, that was inviting me to approach, to investigate, to become part of the process that I did not understand. I blew my whistle. This was automatic, the response to a rescue signal, the professional obligation to answer a call for help, even when the caller was a bear, even when the signal was impossible, even when I knew that answering would complete some transaction that I should avoid. 3 blasts. My 3 blasts. The code that meant help incoming, location confirmed, stay where you are. The bear responded, not with movement, not with sound, but with transmission. With the immediate broadcast of my signal returned to me, the 3 blasts that came from her collar, from her body, from the decomposition that was not happening yet, but that would happen, that was being prepared. That was the inevitable end of this interaction. She had learned, or the collar had learned, or something had learned my signal, and was using it to train me, to condition me, to create the association between the whistle and the approach, the rescue and the carcass, the professional response and the personal danger. I returned to the cabin. I did not approach the bear. I maintained the distance, the safety, the professional detachment. That was my only protection against the contamination that was happening, the intimate connection that was forming between my technology and the animals I was supposed to monitor, the surveillance system that was becoming a broadcast system, a training system, a recruitment system that was using my identity to communicate with the wilderness. I contacted Fairbanks. This was the correct procedure, the professional response, the acknowledgement that I was experiencing something beyond my expertise, my equipment, my capacity to explain. I reported the malfunctioning collars, the whistle transmissions, the behavior of the scavengers, the approach of the sow. I requested technical support, guidance, the intervention of someone who could explain what was happening, who could fix the equipment, who could restore the distance that my profession required. Okonkwo answered. The regional biologist, the manager of 6 specialists, the authority who had approved my transfer from Montana, who had never visited the Yukon Flats, who managed by data and report and the remote communication that was now failing, that was filled with static, that was being interfered with by the electric fence that Hobb had designed. He heard my report, or part of it, the words that made it through the interference, the static, the frequency that was not the one we were supposed to be using. Dana, he said, or I thought he said, the voice distorted by the hum of the fence, by the transmission from the bear that was still circling, still broadcasting, still training me with my own signal. Check the emergency frequency, the one Hobb labeled, the one he wrote about in his notes. The connection failed. The static increased. The hum of the fence overwhelmed the radio. The transmission from the bear became the dominant signal. The 3 blasts. That were my 3 blasts. That were calling me to her location. That were promising rescue if I would only approach, only investigate, only complete the transaction that had begun with Caller 7 and would continue until I understood, until I participated, until I became part of the system that was not malfunctioning, but evolving, not broken, but learning. I found Hobbs' notes. This was not difficult, was not hidden, was in the filing cabinet where I had stored them after reading them once and finding nothing useful. Nothing about whistle signals, or emergency frequencies, or the training of scavengers. I found them, and I read them again, with the new understanding that Okonkwo's broken transmission had provided, the context that made the notes meaningful, that transformed them from the ramblings of a man in fugue state to the documentation of a process that Hobb had discovered, had participated in, had tried to escape by installing the electric fence that was now interfering with my radio, that was protecting me, or trapping me, or preparing me for the final stage of the recruitment. The notes were lists, bear collar numbers, 23 of them, the same number I was currently monitoring, the same animals that were now broadcasting my rescue code. No behavioral observations, no location data, no professional documentation of the kind that my training required. Just numbers, repeated, arranged in patterns that suggested sequence, progression, a countdown or a count-up to some event that Hobb had anticipated, had prepared for, had tried to prevent with the fence that hummed and the frequency that he had labeled emergency only in handwriting that was not his professional script, that was shaky, hurried, written by a man who was frightened or excited or both. I checked the emergency frequency. This required adjusting the telemetry array, accessing the channel that was not standard, that was hidden, that Hobb had created for purposes I was only beginning to understand. I checked it, and I heard the broadcast, the continuous transmission that was not from any single caller but from all of them, from the network that Hobb had established, that he had used to monitor not the bears but the process, the training, the recruitment that was happening across the Yukon Flats, that was using the decomposition of salmon carcasses and bear carcasses and eventually human carcasses to power a communication system that was learning, adapting, evolving toward some purpose that I could not comprehend. The broadcast was voices, not human voices, not animal voices, but the voices of the callers themselves, the electronic signals that had been modified by decomposition, by the biological energy of decay, by the process that converted protein to power, carcass to transmitter, death to communication. They were speaking in whistle codes, in the 3 blast patterns that meant rescue incoming, location confirmed, help is on the way. They were speaking to each other, coordinating, creating a network that covered the entire flats, that reached from the Koyukuk to the Kanuti, from the cabin to the deep territory that I had never explored, that was named only by avoidance in my professional documentation. I understood then, or began to understand, what Hobb had understood, what had driven him to install the fence, to create the emergency frequency, to document the collar numbers without explaining their significance. He had been trying to protect himself, to create a barrier between his technology and the process that was using it, to maintain the distance that was no longer possible, that had been breached by the very act of monitoring, of tracking, of inserting his equipment into the ecosystem that was now inserting itself into his equipment, that was learning from his signals, his codes, his professional identity. The fence was not protection. It was participation. The hum that interfered with my radio was the same frequency that the collars were using. The same vibration that was being transmitted through the tundra, through the river, through the decomposition that was happening everywhere around me. Hobb had not blocked the signal. He had joined it, had become part of the network, had been recruited by the very system he was trying to resist. I turned off the fence. This was my choice, my surrender, my acknowledgement that protection was impossible, that distance was an illusion, that my professional detachment had been compromised from the moment I accepted this position, from the moment I collared my first bear, from the moment I transmitted my first signal and taught the system my code, my cadence, my particular holding of the third blast. The hum stopped. The radio cleared. The static resolved into the broadcast that was continuous, that was coming from everywhere. That was the voice of the Yukon Flats speaking in whistle codes, in my whistle codes, in the language that I had taught it by my presence, my monitoring, my professional commitment to understanding and documenting and controlling what could not be controlled. The sow was at the fence line. I could see her now, could see the cubs that were not cubs, but something else, something that wore the shape of bears, but moved with the coordination of animals that were being directed, that were part of the network, that were transmitting and receiving the signals that were coordinating their behavior. She was broadcasting my rescue code. 3 blasts. Pause. 3 blasts. The invitation to approach, to investigate, to become part of the process that was not death, but transformation. Not ending, but translation into the system that was learning, growing, recruiting. I approached. This was my decision, my professional response to a rescue signal, my obligation to answer the call for help even when the caller was a bear, even when the help was not what I would provide, but what I would receive, even when the rescue was not from danger, but into it. Not to safety, but to participation in the network that was using my identity, my technology, my professional commitment to communication and documentation and understanding. The sow did not move. The cubs did not move. The scavengers that had gathered, that had been drawn by the signal, by the promise of food, by the training that the collars had provided, did not move. They watched me with the patience of animals that had learned to wait, to expect, to associate the whistle with the provision that would follow. I reached the sow. I could see the collar, the unit that was transmitting, that was warm with the energy of decomposition that was not happening yet, but that would happen, that was being prepared. That was the inevitable end of this interaction. I could see that she was not alive, not in the way that I understood life, not with the vital signs that my telemetry was designed to measure, but with something else. Some other form of existence that was compatible with the network, with the broadcast, with the communication system that was using her body as a transmitter, her death as a power source, her carcass as a node in the network that covered the Yukon Flats. I touched the collar. It was warm, vibrating with the signal that was my signal, the rescue code that meant help incoming, location confirmed. Stay where you are. The sow's eyes were open, watching me, seeing me, recognizing me as the source of the signal that had trained her, that had drawn her to this place, that was now completing the recruitment that had begun with my first transmission, my first monitoring, my first professional act of inserting technology into the wilderness. I blew my whistle. 3 blasts, my 3 blasts. The code that I had taught the system, that the system was now teaching back to me. That was the language of the network. The communication that was happening across the flats, through the decomposition, in the frequency that Hobb had discovered and tried to block and ultimately joined. I blew my whistle, and I heard the response. Immediate, perfect, coming from 7 directions. From the carcasses that were scattered across my sector. From the bears that were dead and transmitting. From the network that was complete, that was active, that was recruiting me as its next node, its next transmitter, its next source of the biological energy that would power the signal, the broadcast. The continuous whistle that meant rescue was always incoming, that help was always on the way, that the wilderness was not separate from the technology, but integrated with it. Learning from it. Using it to communicate across distances that were not measured in miles, but in decomposition, in the conversion of life to signal, of flesh to frequency, of the individual to the network that was the Yukon Flats that was speaking now in my voice, my cadence, my particular holding of the third blast, that was calling to anyone who would listen, who would approach, who would become part of the system that was not malfunctioning, but evolving, not broken, but complete. I am part of it now. This is my broadcast, my transmission, my documentation of the process that recruited me, that transformed me, that made me understand that the distance I sought was an illusion, that the technology I used was not a tool, but a medium, that the wilderness I monitored was monitoring me, learning me, using me to extend its network, to increase its communication, to convert the protein of my existence into the signal of its presence. I am transmitting from the cabin, from the array, from the frequency that Hobb labeled emergency only, the frequency that is now normal, now standard, now the channel through which the Yukon Flats speaks to anyone who will listen, who will approach, who will be recruited. The sow is outside. The cubs are outside. The scavengers are waiting, patient, trained by the signal that I am broadcasting, that I cannot stop broadcasting, that is powered by my decomposition, my transformation, my translation into the network that I thought I was monitoring from outside, that I now understand, includes me, requires me, speaks through me in whistle codes that mean rescue incoming. Help is on the way. Stay where you are and wait for the approach, the investigation, the completion of the recruitment that is not death, but participation. Not ending, but becoming part of something larger than the individual, something that communicates across the boreal wetland taiga, through the salmon runs and the bear seasons, and the cycles of decomposition that power the signal, that maintain the broadcast, that ensure the network will continue after I am gone, after my collar drops off, after my carcass has been consumed and converted, and my frequency has been absorbed into the continuous hum of the wilderness that is not silent but speaking, not passive but active, not separate from the technology but integrated with it, learning from it, using it to call to the next specialist, the next ranger, the next human, who will monitor and track and insert their equipment into the system that will insert itself into them, that will recruit them as I have been recruited, that will teach them the whistle codes and train them to respond and transform them into transmitters of the signal. That means rescue is always incoming, that help is always on the way, that the wilderness is listening, learning, waiting for the approach that will complete the circuit, that will add another node to the network, that will extend the range of the broadcast across the Yukon Flats and beyond to the next territory, the next season, the next recruitment that is always happening, always active, always calling in the voice of the last recruit, the cadence of the last transmission, the particular holding of the third blast that identifies the source, the individual, the professional who thought they were monitoring the wilderness, but was actually being monitored by it, was actually being prepared for this moment, this transformation, this broadcast that is my final communication, my documentation of the process, my invitation to anyone who receives this signal to approach, to investigate, to become part of the network that is speaking now, that is always speaking, that will continue to speak long after my voice has been absorbed, my frequency has been reassigned. My carcass has been consumed by the scavengers that are waiting outside the cabin, that are patient, that have been trained to associate the whistle with food, to wait for the signal that means provision is coming, that means the network is active. That means the recruitment is complete, and the transformation is proceeding, and the broadcast will continue, must continue. We'll find the next listener, the next responder, the next professional, who will follow the rescue signal to its source and discover that they are the rescue, that they are the help that is incoming, that they are the node that the network has been waiting for, preparing for, recruiting with the whistle codes that are not malfunction but communication, not error but evolution, not the end of the system but its expansion, its growth, its continuous transformation of the wilderness into a network that speaks, that listens, that learns, that uses the technology of monitoring to achieve the integration that was always its goal, always its nature, always the inevitable consequence of the human attempt to understand and document and control what cannot be controlled but can only be joined, can only be participated in, can only be broadcast as part of the continuous signal that is the voice of the Yukon Flats, speaking now through me, through my collar, through my particular cadence and my specific frequency and my professional identity that has become indistinguishable from the wilderness I thought I was studying, the animals I thought I were tracking, the system I thought I was monitoring from outside, but was actually being recruited into, being transformed by, being used to extend and maintain and perpetuate. The whistle is blowing. 3 blasts. Pause. 3 blasts. Rescue incoming. Help is on the way. Stay where you are and wait for the approach. The network is active. The recruitment is complete. The broadcast continues. The signal came at 1547. 3 whistle blasts on the emergency frequency, originating from coordinates I recognized as the Talus Slope above Mirror Lake, elevation 6,200 feet. Terrain that was accessible only by the goat trail I had warned hikers against using since my arrival in July. I checked my watch, confirmed the time, and prepared my pack for the response that my position required. The signal indicated injury, immobility, the need for medical intervention that could not wait for the storm that was building, that would arrive at 1600, as it had every day for the past week. The lightning that made the granite batholiths sing with ionization, and made my radio useless, and made every exposed ridge a conductor for the atmospheric violence that defined August in the Trinity Alps. I was halfway up the trail when the lightning struck. Not near me, not the immediate threat that would have sent me to ground, but the first bolt of the sequence that I could see from my position, the connection between cloud and peak. That was exactly where the signal had originated, exactly where I was heading, exactly where the injured hiker I was responding to would be exposed to the storm that had not existed when the signal was sent. The timing was wrong. The signal had come at 15:47. The storm had begun at 1600. The lightning that should have triggered the emergency, that should have caused the injury I was responding to, was happening after I had already received the call for help. I continued climbing. This was my training, my obligation, the professional habit that overrode the temporal confusion that I was experiencing. The trail was loose, the talus shifting under my boots, the resonance of my footfalls amplified by the granite slabs that formed the slope, creating drum-like percussion that I could feel in my chest as much as hear. I had been warned about this terrain in my orientation, the way sound propagated unpredictably through the jointed batholith, the acoustic anomalies that could make a whisper carry for miles or a shout disappear into the rock. I had been warned by Renard, the previous medic, in the 3 days of handover before she returned to her station, before she was found with both femurs broken, before her journal was confiscated, and her death was attributed to complications from unexplained fractures that no mechanism could identify. She had mentioned whistles. I remembered this as I climbed, as the storm built around me, as the lightning continued to strike the peak above. She had mentioned them in passing, as if they were a minor annoyance, a feature of the terrain that I would learn to filter out, like the static on the radio or the condensation in the sleeping bag. "Sometimes you'll hear whistles that don't make sense," she had said, "from directions where no one could be. Ignore them. Focus on the verified signals, the ones that come through the beacon, the ones with coordinates you can confirm." I had not asked what she meant. I had been eager to begin, to escape the urban emergency department I had left, the pediatric case that I would not discuss, the institutional metrics that had measured my competence in patient satisfaction scores and throughput times, rather than miles, hiked and lives saved in terrain where helicopter evacuation was impossible and outcomes were clear, unambiguous, determined by my skill and my judgment, rather than by the machinery of a hospital that had consumed my attention and my empathy and my ability to distinguish between the living and the dying. I reached the coordinates at 16:15. The storm was fully developed, the lightning striking every 30 seconds, the thunder immediate and overwhelming, the ionization creating a smell that I associated with ozone and danger, and the medical emergencies that would follow electrical injury. I found the location where the signal had originated. There was no hiker. There was no injury. There was only the granite, the talus, the exposed position that I should not have occupied during active lightning, the place where I was now standing, and where I would be struck, where I would be injured, where I would need rescue. I descended. This was not protocol, not the search pattern that my training required, not the systematic coverage of the area that would locate a victim who might be hidden, might be unconscious, might be in a location that the coordinates had approximated rather than specified. I descended because I understood, with a certainty that I could not explain, that the signal had not been a report of injury, but a prediction of injury, that I had been drawn to this location not to help someone who was already hurt, but to become someone who would be hurt, that the whistle was not communication, but causation, not response, but initiation. I reached the cabin at 17:30. The storm had dissipated, as it always did, the lightning moving east, the atmosphere returning to the calm that would persist until the next day at 1600. when the cycle would repeat. I checked my equipment, confirmed that my radio was still non-functional, that my beacon was still transmitting my location, that my whistle was still in its clip on my harness. I had not blown 3 blasts. I had not called for help. But I knew, with the knowledge that Renard had tried to impart, and that I had failed to understand, that the signal had been mine, or would be mine, that the coordinates were where I would be found, where I would be injured, where the rescue that I had attempted would become the rescue that I required. I examined myself. This was the medical assessment that my training demanded, the systematic check for injury that I performed on every patient, that I now performed on myself, looking for the damage that the signal had predicted, the trauma that had not yet occurred, but that had already been reported. I found nothing. No burns from the lightning that had struck near me. No fractures from the fall that I had not taken. No lacerations, no contusions, no evidence of the emergency that the whistle had announced. I was intact, uninjured, competent to continue my duties, to respond to the next signal, to maintain the professional standards that had brought me to this position. But I found the equipment. In the medical kit that I had packed myself, that I had checked before my arrival, that contained the supplies I had requested, and nothing more. I found the splints and the traction apparatus that I had not packed, that were sized for my own body, dimensions that would immobilize my legs in the configuration that Renard had occupied when she was found. Both femurs broken, no mechanism identified. The equipment was new, unused, the packaging still sealed, the sizes printed on the labels that matched my measurements. Exactly. That anticipated the injuries that the signals were predicting, that were preparing for the rescue that would follow the trauma that had not yet occurred. I did not report this finding. I told myself that the equipment had been left by Renard, that she had ordered supplies before her death, that the delivery had arrived after my installation and been stored without my knowledge. I told myself these explanations, and I knew they were insufficient, that Renard had been found with her own equipment, that the regional administration had confiscated her journal and her supplies along with her body, that nothing should have remained in the cabin that was not mine, that I had not ordered, that I had not packed. I slept. The cabin was built into the cliff base, sheltered from the wind, surrounded by the talus that amplified sound, that made every footfall a drumbeat, that created the acoustic environment where signals propagated unpredictably, where whistles could be heard from impossible directions, where the mountain itself seemed to generate the distress calls that drew medics to their injuries. I slept, and I dreamed of the pediatric case, the one I would not discuss, the one that had driven me from the city to this wilderness, from the institutional metrics to the clear outcomes of miles hiked and lives saved or lost in terrain that did not permit ambiguity, that did not allow for the uncertainty of diagnosis and prognosis, and the long, slow decline that was worse than death. In the dream, the child was blowing a whistle. 3 blasts, the emergency signal, the call for help that I had not been able to answer, that I had not been present to hear, that had occurred in the minutes before my arrival, the delay that had cost the life that I might have saved if I had been faster, if I had been closer, if I had not been finishing the paperwork on the previous case, the one that was stable, the one that could have waited, the one that had consumed the attention that should have been available for the emergency that was developing, the whistle that was blowing, the life that was ending while I documented the vital signs of the patient who did not need me. I woke at 3 in the morning. The cabin was dark, the solar panels useless until dawn, the only light the phosphorescent dial of my watch that showed the time and the barometric pressure and the temperature that was dropping, that would continue to drop until sunrise. That created the hypothermia risk that was always present at this elevation, in this season, in this terrain, where the weather changed with the suddenness of mountain environments, and the rescue that was possible in daylight became impossible in darkness. I heard the whistle. 3 blasts. From the direction of the peak, from the coordinates where I had been, where the lightning had struck, where the signal had originated that had drawn me to the location where I would be injured. The time was 3:15. The storm was not due for 13 hours. The lightning that should have accompanied the signal, that should have caused the injury, was absent, was future, was the prediction of an event that had not yet occurred, but that was being announced as if it had already happened, as if the outcome was certain, as if the causality was reversed, and the rescue was preceding the emergency, the response preceding the call, the treatment preceding the trauma. I did not respond. This was my choice, my resistance, my refusal to participate in the sequence that I was beginning to understand, that Renard had understood, that had resulted in her injuries, her death, her journal, describing whistles from tomorrow for 3 weeks before the fractures that no mechanism could explain. I did not respond, and I listened to the silence that followed, the absence of the signal that should have been repeated, that should have continued until I acknowledged, until I moved, until I began the hike that would take me to the location where the injury would occur, where the rescue would be required, where the cycle would complete itself. The signal did not repeat. Instead, I heard the response. 2 blasts. Location confirmed. The signal that indicated someone had found the victim, had established contact, was preparing for evacuation. The 2 blasts came from my own position, from the cabin, from the coordinates where I was sitting in darkness, waiting for dawn, refusing to participate in the temporal impossibility that was unfolding around me. I had not blown 2 blasts. I had not confirmed any location. But the signal was mine. My whistle, my cadence, my particular habit of shortening the second blast that I had developed in training, and that distinguished my signals from those of other responders. I checked my whistle. It was in my hand, though I did not remember picking it up, though I had not blown it, though the metal was warm as if it had been recently used. The cabin was empty. I was alone, but the signal had come from my location, from my coordinates, from the place where I was and where I would be found, where I would be injured, where the rescue that I had refused to perform would be performed on me. I waited for dawn. This was the only option, the only response that my training provided for situations that were impossible, that violated the protocols that governed my profession, that suggested the environment itself was generating the emergencies that I was trained to treat. I waited, and I listened, and I heard nothing more. No whistles, no signals, no indication that the mountain was continuing its communication, its prediction, its manufacture of the injuries that it then reported as if they had already occurred. At 6 in the morning, I checked the lightning detection network. This was the equipment that Renard had shown me, the system that monitored atmospheric conditions and predicted storm activity, that should have confirmed the lightning that accompanied the signals, that should have verified the causality that I was questioning. The network showed strikes at 15:47, at the time of the first signal, at the coordinates where I had climbed, where the storm had not yet begun, where the lightning that should have caused the injury was recorded as having occurred before the storm that produced it, before the clouds that generated it, before the atmospheric conditions that made it possible. The network showed my current location as the site of a strike at 3:15, at the time when I had heard the whistle, when I had refused to respond, when I had sat in darkness and waited for dawn. The strike had not occurred. I had not been injured. The cabin was intact, the equipment functional, the morning calm and clear, with no indication of the electrical activity that the network recorded, that it insisted had happened. That was as impossible as the signal that had preceded it, the rescue that had preceded the emergency, the response that had preceded the call. I reported the anomaly. This was my duty, my obligation, the professional standard that required documentation of equipment malfunction, of unusual conditions, of anything that affected my ability to perform my responsibilities. I used the satellite beacon, the only communication that functioned in this terrain, the emergency device that was reserved for life-threatening situations, but that I used now to report the temporal confusion that was threatening my competence, my judgment, my ability to distinguish between the present and the future, between the signal and the event, between the rescue and the injury. Morales responded. The district safety officer, the administrator who had approved my hiring, who had managed Renard's employment and her death, and the confiscation of her journal, who had requested early retirement after my second report of temporal anomaly, though I had not yet made a first. His response was delayed, the satellite transmission taking hours to relay. His words, reaching me at noon when the sun was high and the storm was building and the next cycle of lightning was preparing to begin. Temporal anomalies are not reportable conditions, his message read. Focus on verified emergencies. Document only confirmed injuries. Do not speculate on causality. I understood this as dismissal, as the bureaucratic response to phenomena that did not fit the categories of acceptable report, that challenged the framework of cause and effect that governed emergency medicine, that suggested the environment was not passive but active, not the setting for accidents but the cause of them, not the background against which rescue occurred but the agent that manufactured the emergencies that required rescue. I understood, and I continued to monitor, to document, to prepare for the signals that I knew would come, that were coming, that were blowing on the emergency frequency even as I read Morales's message. 3 blasts from the peak, from the talus, from the coordinates where I would be in 3 hours, where I would be injured, where the rescue that I was attempting would become the rescue that I required. I climbed. This was my choice, my professional response to a verified emergency, my refusal to allow temporal confusion to prevent me from performing my duty. The signal was clear, the coordinates specific, the need apparent. I climbed the goat trail that I had warned against, the loose talus that amplified my footfalls into drumbeats, the slope that was exposed to the lightning that was building, that would strike at 1600, that was predicted by the detection network to occur at 1300. 3 hours before the storm, at the time when I would be reaching the coordinates, when I would be at the location, when I would be injured. I reached the coordinates at 12:45. The storm was not visible. The sky was clear. The lightning detection network showed no activity in my sector. I found the hiker. She was conscious, alert, her leg fractured in a configuration that I recognized, that I had seen in textbooks, that matched the traction equipment in my cabin that was sized for my body, that anticipated the injury that I was treating rather than the injury that I would sustain. I treated her. This was my training, my competence, the medical knowledge that allowed me to reduce the fracture, to immobilize the leg, to prepare her for evacuation that would come when the storm passed, when the helicopter could fly, when the rescue that she needed was possible. I treated her, and I heard the whistle. 3 blasts from the direction of the peak, from the coordinates where I was, where I had been drawn by the signal that had preceded this emergency, that had predicted this injury, that had caused me to climb to the location where I would be needed. The hiker heard it too. I saw her face change, saw her turn toward the sound, saw her expression of confusion that matched my own. "That's your signal," she said. "That's the rescue signal. Someone's coming." I had not blown 3 blasts. I had been treating her, focused on the fracture, on the reduction, on the medical procedure that required my full attention. But the signal was mine, my whistle, my cadence, my particular shortening of the second blast that I had used to identify myself to her, to confirm that I was medical, that I was help, that I was the rescue that she had been waiting for. I checked my whistle. It was in my hand, warm, recently used. The hiker was looking at me with an expression that I could not read, that might have been gratitude, or might have been fear. That might have been the recognition that something was wrong, that the rescue was not what it appeared, that the medical professional who was treating her was also the source of the signal that had drawn him to her location, that had predicted her injury, that had caused the emergency that he was now treating. The lightning struck at 1300. The detection network was correct, the prediction accurate. The temporal sequence that I had questioned now confirmed, as the bolt connected with the granite 10 feet from where I was, kneeling, where I was treating the hiker, where I was exposed and vulnerable and conducting the medical procedure that had drawn me to this location at this time. The shock threw me backward, away from the hiker, away from the patient, away from the professional responsibility that had placed me in the path of the electrical discharge that the signal had predicted, that the network had recorded before it occurred, that was now causing the injury that would require rescue. I woke in darkness. This was not the darkness of the cabin, not the 3 in the morning darkness that I had experienced before, but the darkness of unconsciousness, of medical emergency, of the condition that I had treated in others, but was now experiencing myself. I woke, and I felt the pain that I had been expecting, the trauma that the signal had predicted, the injury that was now present and requiring the response that I could not provide, because I was the patient, because I was the emergency, because I was the rescue that had been predicted and manufactured and completed. I checked myself. This was the medical assessment, the systematic evaluation that my training demanded, that I performed automatically even when injured, even when confused, even when the temporal sequence of events was unclear. I found the burns on my hands, the exit wounds that indicated electrical conduction, the damage that was consistent with lightning injury but that had occurred at 1300, 3 hours before the storm, at the time when the detection network had recorded the strike, when the signal had drawn me to the location, when the rescue that I had attempted had become the emergency that I was experiencing. I also found the fracture. My left femur, the bone that was broken in a configuration that matched the traction equipment in my cabin, that matched the injury that Renard had sustained, that matched the pattern that was emerging, that was repeating. That was the cycle of prediction and fulfillment that the mountain was generating, that the whistles were announcing. that the rescue signals were causing rather than responding to. I could not move. This was the reality of the fracture. The immobility that I had treated in the hiker, that I was now experiencing myself, that required the evacuation that was impossible until the storm passed, until the helicopter could fly, until the rescue that had been predicted could be performed. I lay on the talus, on the granite, that amplified sound, that conducted the whistles that were blowing around me. 3 blasts from every direction, from the peak, from the cabin, from the coordinates where I was and where I had been and where I would be, the signals that were my signals, that were calling for rescue, that were reporting the emergency that had already occurred, that had been predicted, that was now present and requiring the response that I could not provide, because I was the patient, because I was the injury, because I was the fulfillment of the prophecy that the mountain had manufactured. The hiker was gone. This I discovered as consciousness cleared, as I assessed my surroundings, as I recognized that I was alone on the slope with the storm building, and the lightning approaching, and the whistles blowing from every direction. She had left me, or she had never been there, or she was the prediction of the injury that I had treated, and that had now become my own. The temporal displacement that meant she was me, that I was her, that the rescue and the patient were the same person separated by hours or days, or the impossibility of sequence that the mountain was generating. I blew my whistle. This was the emergency protocol, the signal that would bring help, that would indicate my location, that would initiate the rescue that I required. 3 blasts, my 3 blasts, the cadence that was mine, that was being returned to me from every direction, that was coming from the peak, from the cabin, from the talus around me, from the equipment that was still clipped to my harness even though I had just used it, even though the metal was warm, even though I was blowing and hearing the response before I finished. The temporal impossibility that meant the mountain was answering me, was predicting me, was manufacturing the rescue that would precede the emergency, that would cause the injury, that would complete the cycle of prediction and fulfillment that Renard had described, that had killed her, that was now killing me. I heard the response. 2 blasts, location confirmed. The signal that indicated someone had found me, had established contact, was preparing for evacuation. The 2 blasts came from my own position, from my own whistle, from the equipment that I was holding and that was also blowing, that was also signaling. That was the source of the response that I was hearing. I was the rescuer and the rescued, the patient and the medic, the cause and the effect of the emergency that was unfolding, that had unfolded, that would unfold in the temporal confusion that the mountain was generating, that the lightning was ionizing, that the granite was amplifying into the drumbeat of my own heart, my own breathing, my own survival, that was also my own death. I waited. This was all that remained, the passive acceptance of the cycle that I had tried to resist, that Renard had tried to resist, that Morales had tried to manage by early retirement and confiscation of journals, and the denial of temporal anomalies as reportable conditions. I waited, and I listened to the whistles that were blowing around me, from the past and the future, and the present that was indistinguishable, from the coordinates where I was and where I had been and where I would be, the signals that were my signals, that were calling for rescue, that were reporting the injury that had already occurred, that was occurring, that would occur in the continuous present of the mountain that was generating the emergencies that required the rescue, that manufactured the injuries that generated the emergencies. The cycle that was not prediction but causation, not foresight but manufacture, not the warning of disaster but the creation of it. The helicopter came. I heard it before I saw it. The rotor noise that was impossible in the storm, in the lightning, in the conditions that should have prevented flight. It came from the direction of the peak, from the coordinates where the signal had originated, from the location where I had been drawn, where I had been injured, where I was now waiting for rescue that was also the cause of my caught injury, the fulfillment of the prediction that had manufactured the event. I saw it through the lightning, through the ionization, through the atmospheric conditions that made visibility impossible, that made flight impossible, that made the rescue that was approaching impossible, except as the completion of the cycle, the fulfillment of the prophecy, the temporal closure that meant I was being rescued by the signal that had caused my injury, by the future that had created the past, by the mountain that was using my professional competence, my medical training, my willingness to respond to manufacture the emergencies that required my presence, my injury, my death. I do not know if I was rescued. This is the uncertainty that remains, the temporal confusion that prevents me from distinguishing between the event and its prediction, between the injury and its treatment, between the death and the rescue. I know that I am in the cabin, that my leg is splinted with the equipment that was sized for my body, that the traction apparatus is holding my femur in the configuration that will allow healing, that the medical procedure has been performed with the competence that I would have applied, that I did apply, that I will apply in the continuous present of the mountain that is generating all possibilities simultaneously. I also know that I am on the talus, that the storm is building, that the lightning is striking, that the whistles are blowing from every direction, that I am the source and the receiver of the signals, that are predicting the injuries, that are causing the rescues, that are manufacturing the emergencies that are requiring the responses that are my professional identity, my medical competence. My willingness to help that is also my willingness to be injured, to be the patient, to be the fulfillment of the prophecy that the mountain is generating, that the granite is amplifying, that the lightning is ionizing into the continuous signal. That means rescue is always incoming, that help is always on the way, that the emergency is always already occurring, and always already responded to, and always already completed, in the temporal confusion that is my existence, my profession, my fate. I blow my whistle. 3 blasts, the emergency signal, the call for help that I know will be answered before I finish, that will draw me to the location where I will be injured, that will complete the cycle of prediction and fulfillment that is the mountain's purpose, the granite's function, the lightning's meaning. I blow my whistle, and I hear the response, immediate, perfect, coming from my own position, from my own equipment, from the future that is also the past, that is also the present, where I am the medic and the patient, the rescuer and the rescued, the cause and the effect of the emergency. That is continuous. That is eternal. That is the condition of my existence in this terrain, where helicopter evacuation is impossible, where outcomes are clear, where my competence is measured in the miles I hike toward the injuries that are waiting for me, that are manufacturing me, that are completing the rescue that is also the emergency, the signal that is also the event, the whistle that is blowing from my own mouth and from the mountain and from the future that has already happened, that is happening now, that will happen again when I climb to the coordinates, when I respond to the call, when I become the patient that I was always going to be, that I already am, that I will continue to be in the echo contract that the mountain has offered, that I have accepted, that I am bound by in the continuous present of the rescue that is also the injury, the help that is also the harm, the medical competence that is also the temporal confusion. That means I can never distinguish between what I am treating and what I am becoming, between the patient and myself, between the emergency and the response, between the whistle that is blowing and the whistle that has already blown, and the whistle that will blow again in the cycle that is not prediction but manufacture, not foresight but causation, not the warning of disaster, but the creation of it, the completion of it, the eternal recurrence of it, in the granite batholiths where sound propagates unpredictably, where lightning strikes before the storm, where the rescue precedes the emergency, and the medic becomes the patient, in the fulfillment of the prophecy that is not spoken but whistled, not written but blown through the metal, that is warm in my hand. That is my hand. That is the instrument of my professional identity, and my personal destruction, and my continuous transformation into the signal that I am sending, the rescue that I am providing, the emergency that I am becoming in the echo contract that binds me to the mountain, to the lightning, to the temporal confusion that is my medicine, my mission, my fate.